Okay, good afternoon. I'd like to call this special meeting of Administration and Finance Committee to order, please. Just in terms of the process for today, it is a formal meeting, so bear with me as I detail some of the requirements under the Municipal Act for such a formal meeting. So the purpose of the meeting today is to make decisions regarding the Regional Development Charge review recommendations as outlined in the report. After the delegations are finished today, we will deal with the report and the recommendations contained therein. And the objective is to have a development charge bylaw established today, which then will be referred to Regional Council next week for formal approval. We are mandated to undertake a review of the Regional Development Charge and bylaw every 5 years. Our current bylaw expires July 31st of this year. Stakeholders in the development charge process and the public have been engaged throughout the development of the background study through public meetings and also through our online portal and also individual meetings and group meetings. For those delegations who are here today who registered prior to the deadline of June 17th, you will have 10 minutes to speak. If you registered after the deadline, you'll have 5 minutes to speak. And in interests of everyone's time, I would ask you to respectfully stick to those time limits, and I will also ensure that you do stick to those time limits. Please give your full name prior to addressing council as a delegation. And as I said, today the goal is to establish the bylaw, refer it to Regional Council for formal adoption next week. Okay? So any direct declarations of pecuniary interest? Seeing none, okay. Oh, sorry, Councillor Foxton. Hang on. Okay, I think your mic's on now.
Thank you. I have the subject matter is brownfield development charges and under COR-FSD-19-29, item G. And I have a declaration as my son-in-law works for a company that does brownfield remediation.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So our first delegation is Mr. Robson. Oh, sorry. My apologies. Mr. Dyer. We're going to have the presentation first. I know I want to get through this quickly, but not that quickly.
So thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm just going to make a few comments on the first couple of slides, which hopefully we can get up on the screen. There we go. And I'm just going to do the first couple of slides, and then I will turn it over to Shane Fedy, who will walk us through walk us through the remainder of the slide deck. So if we could go to the next slide, as I said, I'll just touch on the first couple. So the agenda for today, we're going to go through a little bit of background. The presentation is basically covering the RDC rates and policies that are established in the staff report that was released back on the 7th of June. We did issue an addendum to that report, which covered two items. One was the passing of Bill 108, which happened on June the 6th. And then we had a late request for an exemption for long-term care and retirement homes. And we have a recommendation in the report for that as well. And then just a little bit about next steps. But the bulk of the presentation is just going through the recommendations on rates and policies set out in the staff report. And just by, again, I know the committee has seen this slide before, and the next one as well, but we thought it was important to just reinforce, that for growth to happen and to ensure housing supply, it does require investments in infrastructure to service land. And as I have said many times before committee and before council, we have three sources of funding to do that with. And one is property taxes, and one is user rates, and one is development charges. And to the extent that development charges are either increased or decreased, that has a corresponding but opposite effect with respect to both property taxes and user rates. And our capital program suggests that we'll be investing in the area of $1 billion in development charge funded infrastructure over the next 10 years. And we'll be incurring $120 million in debt servicing costs for debt that we've already issued for services that are now in place. We showed this, I think, a couple of meetings ago, but again, just to give context to the discussion today, we have seen a pattern over the last 5 or 6 years of our development charge reserve fund balances falling. That's the green line on this chart. And you can see balances which were in the $80 million range are now below the $40 million range at the end of 2018. Collections have been variable. They have increased in certain years for various reasons. Rates, were increased in 2014 and then a little bit in 2017 as well. But importantly, I think one of the most important parts of this chart is the line at the bottom. And that shows the growth-related debt servicing costs based on debt that we've issued over the last six years. In 2012, the region didn't have any growth-related debt. We've now issued a significant amount, and as I said earlier, the debt servicing costs on that debt are about $12 million a year. And so the way to interpret that is the first $12 million of development charges that we collect in any given year will go towards the servicing of existing debt. And then what we have is funds available to deal with future projects. So that's just a little bit of context in terms of balances, in terms of the collections we've had over the last few years, and the increasing amount of growth-related debt over the last 6 or 7 years. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Shane. And as I said earlier, Shane's going to basically walk through the recommendations that are included in the report from June the 7th, talk a little bit about Bill 108, and then we'll turn it over to delegations and debate.
Thanks, Greg. Good afternoon. I just have a very brief presentation for you today. I know we went through this in a lot more detail at the council information session on June the 5th. So today's really just a reminder of the recommendations that are contained in the staff report and the addendum as well. Thanks, man. So the first recommendation is regarding residential development charge rates. It's recommendation 2A, and that is to set the residential development charge rates in the DC bylaw at the rates described in the 2019 recommended column of Table 1 in Appendix A. So that table follows. So this table just shows moving left to right. It has the services. The 2014 calculated indexed rate was the rate in 2014 that was calculated as the max permissible rate. If you recall, there was a 10% discount to the transportation, water, and wastewater. That's how we got to our current rate of $22,659. And then through the development charge background study, you can see the calculated rate of $28,056 in the cities, $25,630 in the townships. The difference there is just due to the fact that transit's area rated to the 3 cities and library services are area rated to the townships. And that calculated rate is the rate that will be recommended by the steering committee through the report. And this chart just shows the various rates. The last one was based on a single semi-detached home, where you can see the $28,056 is the recommended rate. And then it shows the same kind of rates for the townhouse, apartment, and lodging units that we'd collect on the residential side for both the cities and the townships, compared with our current DC rates. And then the increases there. So in the cities for a single semi, the increase for the recommended rate is about just under $5,400. Townhouse just under $4,000. Apartments $2,936, and then so on. Just again with the residential rates, the comparator charts, the red bars, arrows coming down would show the region and the local's current DC rates. It includes a piece for the education component as well. The yellow bars will show the calculated rates and the recommended rates for the region and the locals in the case of the City of Kitchener and the City of Cambridge, as they're at a point in their process where they have rates available. For the City of Waterloo, they're not quite there yet with their background study review, so that would reflect the region's calculated rate and the City of Waterloo's current rate. You can see we kind of land a little bit in the middle. As you move down towards the GTA, the rates tend to get a little bit higher. And again, this is just a similar chart for the apartment rates. So same relative positioning as the single detached. So with regards to the non-residential rate structure, recommendation 2B in the report deals with that. I recommend setting the non-res development charge rate at the rates described in the 2019 recommended column of Table 2 in Appendix A. So that table follows in this chart. And again, similar to what I showed for the single detached houses, the 2014 calculated shows the rate that was calculated in 14 indexed. Our current rate is $12.18 a square foot and $10.22 a square foot in the townships. The 2019 calculated and recommended rate increases to $16.07 a square foot in the cities and $14.17 a square foot in the townships. And our current bylaw does have a 50% discount to the industrial rate. Recommendations 2C and D, they recommend a 50% discount to the non-residential rate. So in the cities to the $16.07 on the previous slide. And that would be for qualifying industrial development and for qualifying office development in urban growth centers, meeting 20,000 square foot threshold above the second story. So that rate would effective rates. So on the non-residential side, you can see the 2019 recommended rate with the applicable discounts in place. So on the industrial side, the current rate with the discount $6.09 a square foot in the cities, that would increase to $8.04. The office for urban growth centers meeting the appropriate threshold would come down $4.15 to $8, and then commercial industrial would be at the calculated rate of $16.07. And again, just same chart in the townships, difference due to the area rating. So the industrial would be $7.09 in the UGC office. Current rates there, $5.11 for industrial and $10.22 for office. So again, the comparator charts, this just shows the non-res industrial DC survey with the 50% discount in place. Again, the red bars are the current rates, the yellow bars are the calculated rates. A similar chart for the qualifying commercial with the 50% discount. Again, as you move towards the GTA, things tend to increase substantially. And similar chart again for the commercial in absence of the 50% discount. So this is the full $16.07 per square foot on the region side versus the comparators. Recommendation 2E addresses the geographic exemptions, and that is to approve a DC exemption in the downtown core areas in the city of Cambridge, provided that a similar exemption is included in the city of Cambridge's development charge bylaw, which was approved yesterday. They've included that. On the redevelopment credit side, again, those are provided for existing development on a site. So if you have a site with an existing single detached house on it, you demolish that house and build another one, you wouldn't pay DCs on the house that you built. Same on the non-residential side. If you've got a 20,000 square foot facility, it gets demolished, you wouldn't pay DCs on the first 20,000 square feet that you create on your site. Those do have a time frame to them. Current bylaw, they are 7 years for both res and non-res. This recommendation is to reduce the time frame on the residential side from 7 years to 5 years. On the non-residential side, it would increase from 7 to 10 years. And then for sites that are greater than 10 hectares and requires a record of site condition, that would increase from 7 to 15 years. Uh, 2G speaks to the brownfield. The recommendation there is to amend the Region's Brownfield Financial Incentive Program as described in report PDL CPL 1915. That came in March of 2019. So the recommendations are consistent with as they were in that report. And that is to discontinue the phase 2 environmental assessment grants. On the regional development charge side, we would see a shift from DC exemptions to the TIGs over the 5-year life of this bylaw. We would remove the 20% allowance for indirect costs. Currently, in the DC side, you can get 100% of the remediation costs plus an additional 20% for indirect. That would remove the 20% for indirect. We'd set the amount of eligible remediation costs recovered through the DC exemption subject to a $1 million cap per brownfield site. Currently, the current bylaw does not have a provision for a cap. So 100% of the direct remediation costs, if the record of site condition is issued on or before December 31st, 2021, and then for the balance of the bylaw, it would be 50% of the direct remediation costs. And on the tax increment side, it would be to remove the 10% allowance for indirect costs. With respect to area rating, as I mentioned, Region's past practice has been to area rate the transit development charge to the 3 cities and the library development charge to the 4 townships. The recommendation is to continue with that. And just on the financial implications side related to the exemptions and discounts, we are required to fund those from user rate and tax levy sources. The downtown core area strategy, so that represents the building permits that were issued prior to the expiry on February 28th of 2019. So we're just about $41 million there. Per the approved strategy, we're going to fund those out over the next 10 years, so we'll be $4.1 million a year. For the Cambridge core, for planning purposes, we've estimated about $2 million annually. $1 million for the brownfields, and then the other includes industrial office and farming. That would be about $1.5 million. So total at this point is $8.6 million annually. Our current budget provisions are in the 2019 budget are just over $4.5 million. So there will be some incremental budget impacts potentially in 2020, 21, and 22, and we will revisit those as we move through the budget process. And then the addendum to the report.
Shane, sorry, I'm just going to stop you right there because we have a question. Councillor Banovic?
Oh, I can wait till the end of the presentation.
Well, is it on Bill 108? Because I think he's wrapping it up with Bill 108.
Well, no, it's on the RDCs. But I'll wait till the end.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. So again, the addendum to the report addressed 2 items. The first being Bill 108, which received royal assent on June the 6th. So the community benefits charge framework will come into effect at a date to be determined based on a call we had with the ministry yesterday. We're anticipating that date to be January 1st of 2021. So there's 2 options to consider for our new bylaw based on, excuse me, the approval of the bill. We could pass a new DC bylaw that includes all the services as outlined today. The other option that came with that is we could potentially pass a new DC bylaw for the hard services, and the soft services would remain under the current bylaw. Due to the fact that the region's bylaw is predominantly hard services on the overall quantum of the rate, it doesn't have a very large impact. It's about $340 between those 2 options on a single detached in the city, so just over 1%, and about $750 in the townships, which is about just under 3% of their rate. If we looked at the second option, administratively, it's a little problematic for us because we would have, there's several policy updates that I've just walked through that are going to be reflected in the new bylaw, that if we leave our soft service rates under the old rules, they're going to operate under two different policy frameworks. The example there is the new bylaw contains a provision for core area exemptions in the city of Cambridge. And if we leave our soft services under the old bylaw, we'd have to collect for soft services in the core areas. Only the hard would be exempt. And then the other item that was addressed through that report is there was a request to exempt long-term care and retirement homes. So we did receive some correspondence from peopleCare Group, Care Us and Care Nursing and Retirement Homes in Twin Oaks and Maryhill. Staff are recommending that council take no action on that request. The region's bylaw does assess DCs on all development unless specifically exempted. There's currently no provision in either our current or our proposed bylaw that would exempt these types of development at this point. And just to wrap up, under next steps, we'll have council approval of the bylaw next Wednesday on June the 26th. The new rates and policies and everything under that bylaw would come into effect as of August the 1st of this year. And obviously, we'll continue to monitor progress with Bill 108, and as we get more information, we'll report to committee as needed. We will update the funding in the 2019 capital project based on the information that's in the development charge background study. And we're about to start preparation of the 2020 to 2029 capital program.
Okay, thank you. We've got a couple questions. Councillor Banovic.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the summary. Incidentally, we just approved ours at the city of Kitchener recently, and went the route of going with the new rule. Sorry, with the old rules, and we'll revisit it once we know what's happening with soft services through the regulations that Bill 108 proposes. Two questions, though, with respect to the issue of brownfield properties, because this continues, as I indicated at the presentation last week, this continues to be an area of concern, and been talking to numerous people, as I know others have as well, over the last little while. The area where we go from 7 to 15 years, there's nothing in legislation limiting us to 15 years. So if we wanted to go to 20 years on those large projects, there's nothing preventing us from doing that if that was a direction that committee wanted to go.
Through you, Chair, that's correct.
Okay. And then the other one, so as I understand it right now, with the new bylaw kicking in on August the 1st, that would mean that anybody who happened to be ready could apply, and anybody who happened to be ready, has their RSC, and applies for a building permit by July the 31st would apply under the old rules, but anybody new would apply under the new rules. And then the new rules have a phased-in approach for future projects. Is there anything preventing us from putting in an option where, as long as anybody registered, filed an application of some kind, and we'd have to, between now and council, figure out what that would look like, filed an application by July 31st of this year, that they could still have the old rules apply to them for the balance of this bylaw, as long as they obtained a record of site condition and a building permit by the end of the bylaw. But anybody post July 31st, in other words, who didn't register, would then have the new rules apply to them. And what I'm really getting at here is trying to ensure that we're being fair to the properties who have started work, been contemplating work, and we've heard from are now going to be negatively impacted as a result of the direction that we're going.
So, Shane, I'll get Mr. Dyer to respond to that.
So through you, Mr. Chair, on, I'm just looking for the page number in the report here. Just bear with me for 1 second.
Do you want that slide that Shane had? Slide detailing all the changes?
Yeah, I think I need, just I'm almost there. So on page 27 of the agenda of the report, the original report that was issued back on June the 7th. So we indicate through that report that the transition provisions in the new draft bylaw will allow sites that have completed applications prior to the expiry of the existing bylaw to remain under the current RDC brownfield exemption rules. So if part of the question is, could we set a different measure or standard for who's eligible and who isn't, then I think the short answer to that is yes. I think there's some flexibility in terms of how we set it. I think, we're trying to find a balance here between, ensuring that the region has the funds that it needs in order to put the infrastructure in place. If there is direction from committee to pursue a different, I'll say, grandfathering strategy or eligibility strategy, then I think we would need some very specific parameters to work with. Like, I think we would need to know what is it that council's looking to have grandfathered or not grandfathered, because we would need to do two things. The first would be to figure out how to word it in the bylaw so that it's crystal clear who's in and who's out under the current rules, and to the extent that those rules would allow for additional developments to fall within the existing strategy, or sorry, the existing brownfield program, then we would need to do a costing and make sure it was clear to council what the financial implications were of that change and what the budget impacts would be. Because as we've said, many times, development charges that we don't collect, we have to fund from other sources. And I think it would be incumbent upon staff to put that in front of council before a decision was made.
So I guess as a follow-up to that, Mr. Dyer, I mean, I don't know how you would cost projects that aren't yet registered. You can, I guess, take some estimates based on ones that we anticipate might already be part of the process. But I guess the other thing that maybe concerns me a little bit about that response, and I agree with you that it's important to understand some of these issues, but it's really today where committee's having its opportunity to consider the work of the steering committee and make recommendations that are going to go to council. And so presumably that could include some amendments. I mean, this is really the first time that regional council in its capacity as finance committee has the first opportunity to consider this, and has its first opportunity to put motions on the floor. And so I know with respect to the two questions I asked, those are amendments that I'm going to be proposing later on. There may be others that other colleagues around the horseshoe have, and I would expect that that's part of the good, healthy, democratic debate and process we're going to undertake today. And so that may change percentages, that may change things that are going to happen, right? So that's part of the reality.
Councillor Vanovic, I don't think Mr. Dyer is suggesting that they're not open to amendments. It's in committee's hands. And I think his first response to your question about the potential grandfathering, he said, yes, it is possible. But then he used his experienced opinion to editorialize on why he doesn't think that's a good idea. But he did not at any time say this committee, cannot make amendments. So I think, just to be clear, that amendments are in order, and I'll lay out a process in which I would like to deal with them once we get to the recommendations contained in the report. But I do have a question related to that, though. I know Councillor Galloway wants to get into this as well, but so Mr. Dyer, to qualify for the Brownfield Financial Incentive Program right now, what piece of paper do you need to give to the region?
If I may, Mr. Chair, I might ask Ms. Sergi to respond.
Yeah, Michelle?
Through the chair, what's required or the benchmark that we're using currently is a complete application. So it would require a record of site condition. It may or may not require a building permit to be pulled. It would require cost estimates associated with it, as well as a formal development concept in which we could then cost out the RDC exemption components. That's it.
Okay.
That's essentially. There's other elements, but those are the
And
large
knowing that our current bylaw is expiring and we're contemplating these changes, have we seen a rush of applications of record of site conditions and applications for brownfield exemption program?
Through the chair, I wouldn't suggest that there's been a rush on applications. What I would say is that we have a number of applications or a number of property owners who have come in and asked about potential eligibility for the program, and so we've been dealing with those, and they're in various states of having available information that they can provide to us to inform what the process could potentially look for them. So we have some that are much more further developed, that would be closer to receiving or to being able to submit a record of site condition as part of their package, as well as we have some that are very, very early in the process who are just in sort of those preliminary stages of starting to gather informations. And so there's also a series of people who have been coming in and not just taking a look at the RDC component, but also the tax increment grant component. And I would say that we have had a certain number of applicants that are fairly close to meeting all of those requirements now coming in and providing all of that information in advance of the end of this bylaw.
Okay, so the anticipation is that there will be some applications that will be approved before the new bylaw comes into place. Ms. Arnold, do you want to get in on this?
Sorry. No, go ahead.
Sorry, just to be clear, the tax increment grant program is not part of the RDC bylaw. So the tax increment grant program continues unchanged regardless of the new development charges bylaw. So it's, I think also, sorry, I apologize for whispering to my colleague here, but it's important also to note that a number of these people who have come forward expressing interest in the region's brownfield program are expressing interest in the tax increment grant program, which, as I've said, continues regardless of the outcome of the new RDC bylaw process.
Okay. All right. So, Michelle, then, in your opinion, is it reasonable to expect that there will be some applications for the brownfield that will be approved before the new bylaw comes into place?
So when we did the initial evaluation, there were 3 properties that were fairly close to being able to come in with a complete application. 2 of those have recently come in. They've been waiting for the record of site condition, quite frankly. 2 of those have recently come in, and they will meet the criteria. We're waiting on a 3rd, and the timing of that is somewhat uncertain.
All right. Thank you. Councillor Galloway?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It wasn't on this that I wanted to ask a question. I wanted to ask, this really has to do with maybe the larger elephant in the room in terms of the provisions, the proposed provisions in Bill 108 that is going to substantively change both the upper and the lower tiers' ability to collect development charges, and whether, and I understand, of course, that we have to proceed in this particular process as if that is not in place, and we'll revisit once those regulations are known. But certainly on the surface, particularly at the lower level, is going to be particularly problematic for lower tier municipalities to achieve their capital programs without significant property tax increases. So have we or anybody else attempted to model what our rates would look like under that new regime both at the residential and non-residential rate. Now, I understand that this, from a competitive point of view, across municipalities, of course, all municipalities are going to be subject to the same rules. So that's, if there's lower residential development charges here, there will be in other jurisdictions as well, similarly on non-residential development. But has anybody taken a stab at whether or not that's 10%, 15%, whatever percent lower development charges per residential unit, per square foot of non-residential development? Because ultimately, the elephant in the room is how do we pay for our capital programs if we can't collect the same amount of money through the development charges at the same time that we're having reduced funding for EMS, reduced funding for childcare, reduced funding for a whole variety of services that we're already aware of, and only having the property taxes really to rely on to deal with any shortfalls.
Yeah, Mr. Dyer has been rapidly scrolling through his spreadsheets, and I think he has an answer to your question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I would turn the committee's attention to page 113 of the consolidated agenda, which shows a table. I'll just describe it as well. Shows the residential rates, both current and what's being proposed through the two options. And I think the main message with respect to the region's development charge is that soft services comprise a very small component of the regional development charge. So the components that we're talking about specifically at this point relate to airport and library. And those are two very small components of our development charge. Once Bill 108, sorry, I got to word this right. Once the amendments to the Development Charges Act arising from Bill 108 come into effect, then a residential single semi-development charge, would drop by, less than $500 in the cities and by about $750 in the townships. And that's just because the majority of our bylaw is for hard services. The impact is much more significant at the local municipal level, particularly in municipalities who are investing heavily in, I'll say, recreation, parks, infrastructure, and so for two reasons. One, that component generally makes up a fairly large component. It's a fairly large piece of their development charge in total. And it's that piece and those soft service pieces in the local municipality development charge that will be coming out at some point. So minor impact to the region, generally significant impact at the local municipality level.
Okay. Go ahead. No, hang on.
Yeah, and I appreciate the greater impacts here at the lower level, but there's only one property taxpayer, so the Home Builders Association and developers, they use the combined rates. That's what they work with in terms of development charges. They don't necessarily break it down between the two levels. So the development charges are going to come down. If we need to maintain and must maintain our capital programs, then we have to find other ways to fund them. The same as we have to find other ways to fund discounts or exemptions that we may provide. And then we have to do this in the context of reduced funding for other services, like I said, for EMS and childcare and a number of others that we've already been informed of. In some cases, a bit of a reprieve till the new year, but nonetheless coming back in full force coming January. And so I think we have to keep that in mind in terms of the decisions that we're going to be making today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Jaworski.
Thank you, through the chair. Actually, a quick question of clarification for planning staff on the response regarding a complete application. The response included that a complete application may or may not require a building permit. And I think that's part of my big concerns here, is what is a complete application regarding the building permit? That would be helpful. Thank you.
Michelle, yeah.
Through the chair. So really what we're looking for is the record of site conditions. So they would have to make the actual application. It would be a record of site condition. There's an acknowledgement from the Ministry of the Environment. They would need a work plan or an action plan that sets out how they're to go about doing the remediation, certificate of a property use if required. They would have to have cost estimates that would have to be validated by a qualified person. They would have to have invoices, if applicable, paid invoices from the contractor, eligible costs all worked out. There's some signed declarations that are required with respect to whether or not there's any liens on the properties or tax arrears, things of that nature. So there's a package of things that are required in order for applications to be deemed complete.
But what about the building permit part? That's the part I'm still confused about.
So through the chair, it depends on on how the remediation is occurring. So sometimes as part of a process, a building permit is required or on-site remediation work is required throughout the process in order to get your RSC. And so in that case, in some cases, you will find that a building permit is required. But it's not mandatory.
Okay, I might have further questions later. Thank you.
So when, sorry, I didn't get that, Michelle. When is a building permit required?
So essentially, it's not necessarily required.
Yeah, so the building permit's not required.
Oh,
It's a record of site condition we need.
really,
right?
it's the record of site condition,
Yeah.
which may or may not require a building permit to be pulled.
May or may not, but when would we, i.e. may require a building permit?
As part of our criteria, it's not required.
Okay.
It's part of the redevelopment process, and it depends on whether or not you're doing a traditional record of site condition or whether you're doing a site-specific.
So is it fair to say it's rare that we require a building permit?
Generally speaking, we don't require
Okay.
a building permit.
Does that help, Dave? Okay. All right. So I got Councillor Zhao, then Councillor Foxton, and then we have 10 delegations, and so then it'll be in committee's hands. So I think we'll allow for the next two, and then we'll go to delegations. So Councillor Foxton.
Thank you, and through the chair. I understand the situation we're in, and with the new bills and that, it makes it even more difficult. But I also am very concerned about our competitiveness. I know we have charts that state that the development charges in Peel and this place and that is this and that, but in the township, and I know Councillor Nowak, Mayor Nowak, also has the same situation, we have London and Woodstock to the south of us. And they are lowering their land prices and their development charges, financial development charges, they're giving relief to be competitive. Now, we've always set our development charges as this committee and as our township, and in the last few years, we haven't met our targets. So how do we remain competitive and draw development and yet still raise these prices? Or can we not? And that's what I'm concerned. What makes it work? Because I think as a region, we have to make it work, or we're going to be left out because there's other places that are attempting to make it work for developers because they need the development.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Jowett.
Thank you, through the chair. So, Mr. Dyer, I'm wondering if there's an exercise that we can indulge in just to see what, so for example, in the past when industrial and office RDCs were not blended, we discounted the industrial DC by 50%. So now that we are blending industrial office, making the industrial DC higher, perhaps the 50% discount might not be sufficient. So in the interest of being competitive, as Councillor Foxton has so eloquently articulated, I'm wondering if we can do an exercise that could allow us to understand what another 10% and then another 20% would cost.
So you're saying, so right now, the recommendation is a 50% discounted rate for industrial, and you're wondering what, a 60% and a 70% discounted rate in terms of lost revenue
Yes.
would cost us? I know Craig's good with spreadsheets, but I don't think he's that good.
That's certainly a calculation we could do and bring back for the committee.
Okay.
So this is not something we could do here today?
I think we might be able to get it done
Well,
today.
we can take a look at the table that shows the estimated cost of the development of if it's just the industrial exemption we're referring to, we could take a look at that piece and estimate what an additional 10% would cost, and we could do the math from there. So just give us a few minutes, we'll take a look at it.
And so I just want to reiterate, before I ever got involved in politics, I sat on a cute little group called Canada's Technology Triangle, and I'm very concerned about those East Side lands because it seemed to take up so much of our time, and rightly so, because the employment opportunities are there are quite significant. And it was always my role on CTT to look at the employment market and the job market and look for the stimuluses to be able to keep us prosperous when it comes to jobs. So I'm really hoping that we can get some really good information there and make a really strong decision for our community when it comes to employment.
Okay, thank you. Chair Edmund?
Thank you, Chair Strickland. I was just actually going to respond to the sentiment that Councillor Foxton was putting forward. And I think this is a really good discussion, and I think people are trying to be helpful, and I think that's a great thing. There's a great deal of uncertainty with Bill 108, which has been proclaimed, but the regs have not been established yet. So there's a way bigger hit on the local tier municipality through the CBC, the community benefit charges, than there is at the region. But the premise that the minister stated going into Bill 108, and indeed why we look at regional development charges, is that growth should pay for growth. And I would caution that as much as some of these discounts and changes to what's been part of the recommendation may or may not be good ideas and may in fact enhance growth, it will hobble us in our ability to put in the kind of infrastructure that growth depends on. It might have exactly the perverse effect, which is people want an industrial park built or they want a subdivision okayed, and we will not be in a position where we can put in those pipes and the hard infrastructure that the region includes in its development charges.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Clark.
Thanks. This isn't a directly related question, but since we seem to be getting a little bit off questions, I'll ask it anyway. Maybe I'm misremembering, but I understand that a report that came to us came to the Finance Committee from with regards to Bill 108 estimated that we would be paying another $75 million in development charges over the coming 10 years as a result of the changes that the bill already includes. If that's so what I'm asking is, am I right in understanding that we are already going to be shifting $75 million onto the property tax levy off of developers as a result of this bill?
Mr. Dyer.
Through you, Mr. Chair, the analysis we've done with respect to the airport development charge, so looking at the region's 10-year capital program, we have about or anticipating about $75 million worth of development charges to fund growth-related costs associated with airport expansion.
With airport expansion.
Airport expansion, right. So that's what's in the 10-year capital program right now. And so with the passing of Bill 108, we know that the airport development charge will cease to exist at some point in the future. We don't know the date yet. And so that will result in us not collecting an airport development charge. So that doesn't change the capital cost side. And on the assumption that we were to go ahead with those projects, then they would be funded from the property tax base.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. No further questions. Good discussion. That sets the stage for our delegations. And our first delegation is Mr. Robson. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Chair Strickland, members of the committee. On that question of Bill 108, I probably know less than anyone in the room, but I thought maybe that would get, some of that would get picked back up in the community benefits part of the Bill 108, but I haven't read the regs either because they don't exist. As always, when I sit here, I decide I'm going to go out of order and forget everything I wrote down. I'd like to start with our analysis of some of the numbers. If you look at page 27, and I'm referring to the big number at the top of the page, there's two different numbering systems, it says that $7.1 million has been exempted to date. The program's been with us for 13 years. That works out to $546,000 a year in exemption. It mentions a $13.4 million figure for exemptions as well, which I'm not quite sure what it means. But if we go with that figure, then over the 13 years of the program, that works out to about $1 million a year. And one of the graphs that was put up on the screen just at the beginning showed the projected exemption costs on, again, this is on page 33 of the big numbers, and they're projecting $1 million in brownfields in exemption costs for brownfield exemptions. One of the things that staff has pointed out is that the BFIP programs have generated $800 million worth of new assessment in the time that they've been with us. And there was a request at the March meeting for a return on investment analysis, which I'm assuming you got. We didn't, but we're not entitled necessarily to share in it. Our rough math, which is really rough, me and assessment don't do much together, but I figured probably from what I'm seeing that $800 million is going to generate to the region $5 or $6, $7 million a year in taxes. So I have a suggestion. It's a little facetious. I just can't help myself. In order to make up the shortfall, you should double the exemption, because $546,000 a year or even $1 million a year is generating you $5 or $6 million a year in return from the numbers that I've seen. So, and if you're looking at what is it going to cost you, perhaps projecting what it has cost or in the past on an annual basis, grossing that up might give you some idea. But we're not apparently looking at $10, $20 million a year in exemption costs. Historically, under $1 million if that's been spent to date, maybe $1 million if the 13.4 is the relevant number. So the numbers are not as staggering as I thought they might have been. I'll touch briefly on the frame bud plant, but the potential for $10 million of exemptions there has hopefully been largely eliminated by the redevelopment allowance changes. And I'll go back to where I was going to start so I don't forget everything else I was going to say. But that's just something I think is important to figure out, that it looks like it has not been that expensive, but it's generating tons of assessment. I can't find an investment that good anywhere else that I've looked. And I'm not aware of a building permit ever being required. By the time you get your RSC under the current program, the Brownfields exemption, you don't need a subsequent building permit to be in the program. And I would like to know whether the frame bud plan is one of those approved projects. But I'm going to restrict my other comments to redevelopment allowance. I do appreciate the increase for large contaminated sites to 15 years. That's a very progressive step, and I thank staff and committee for suggesting that. I would like to point out that there's not very many sites that are going to qualify for that time period. You got to be over 10 hectares in size, and you have to have an RSC. So there's not a lot of people lining up with that kind of size of sites. And if they do, I think everyone wants them to go forward because they're going to be very beneficial. The 15-year time limit, though, is still potentially too short, especially if we have any economic changes or downturns or waits while we're waiting for economies to recover. My classic, again, is always the frame bud site, and it's halfway through that 15-year period. Its first building permit's probably going to come early in the new year. So that leaves it 6 years to get building permits on 75 acres of land. So that could not happen. And you have to get building permits on your whole site to qualify for the whole redevelopment allowance, because it gets apportioned proportionally amongst the site once it's subdivided. So the 15 sounds like a long time. It isn't necessarily so. There's only a few sites that are going to use it. Why cut it so fine? Trust me, they don't need any incentive at this stage to sell out or try to sell out. But once you get this far into a project, even starting the remediation, you don't need any more incentive to try to get out of it because you've got so much money in it. You can't just sit and look at it. So if it's underway, you don't need the incentive of make it 15 as opposed to 20. They're going to sell as hard as they can, and I think everybody else will as well. And even the Schneider site could get caught on that if they hit an economic downturn. So I'm really requesting very strongly that 20 years be the time period for the large contaminated sites. You're not opening the floodgates. You're helping large projects that will benefit the community a whole bunch. I'm very discouraged about the recommendation about the exemption. It looks like the March report is what we're living with. We found that difficult then. We find it difficult now. It's good that that doesn't speak anymore to the fact that it's not needed and lenders are lining up to line money, which is what the March report said, because that was just wrong. The $1 million upper limit is not recognizing the difference between a frame bud type of site or a 1 acre site. It really, if you're going to do this, and we strongly request that you don't, it really, I suggest it should be some kind of proportionality, dollars per acre, something like that. A two-unit townhouse site should not be treated the same as a 75-acre frame bud site. Just repeating again, because it's in my notes, this doesn't appear to be an expensive program. It's got a heck of a good return. I'm also concerned a little bit about the suggested costs of the exemptions. I understand that the frame bud numbers might be in there. I'm not sure. But the thing I think we have to focus on is if the 15-year redevelopment allowance lets frame bud get finished, they won't be taking hardly any exemption, if at all, because you have to take your redevelopment allowance first. If there's a redevelopment allowance available, you don't get to go to the exemption. And so frame bud had 1 million square feet that they knocked down. Schneider's had, I think, 750,000 square feet they knocked down. Neither of those sites is going to get anywhere near an exemption, even if it is available, for years, till they use up those exemptions, and they may never actually build more than what they knocked down. So the numbers may not be as scary as we initially thought because of, I think, the progressive move that was made on the redevelopment allowance, which will eliminate a lot of these redeveloped sites from getting at the exemption in any significant way. The grandfathering, I have an issue with. There's the staff report says on page 23, and I'm not sure if this is big numbers or little numbers. I wrote these at different times, but one of the page 23s. Transition provisions in the new draft bylaw will allow sites that have completed applications prior to the expiry of the existing RDC by July 31 to remain under the current RDC. What it doesn't mention is if you go to the actual bylaw, I didn't find this, my student did, but I tried to let him know I'd seen it myself, and I was testing him. But it says in there on one line, provided a building permit has been issued before the expiry of this current bylaw. So that's a new little wrinkle that isn't being publicized very much. And that, in my view, is unfair. If you've got a complete application in, which does not currently require a building permit, why did this little one-liner show up in the bylaw now that says you can be grandfathered if you get a building permit before the end of July? I respectfully request, if we're going to do away with the exemption, which again we strongly hope that you don't, that be removed, and that complete applications at the very least be complete applications under the current bylaw and grandfathered. And the suggestion that was made about signing up and getting your RSC and complete application in the 5-year period, that would work. We can endorse that very strongly. But that grandfathering, the frame bud site's not going to qualify under that because they're not going to get a building permit. They're not registered. They won't be registered probably until August or September. I view the program, and it was said at the March meeting, that the region has received awards, accolades, interest nationwide on their regional brownfields program. According to the staff report, Brantford, Hamilton, and Niagara all offer 100% exemption with no arbitrary limits on amount, as far as I can tell from the report. So my comment is, since when is being a leader with an innovative program dealing with a hugely important matter such as environmental remediation a reason to end a program that's generating for you, according to the numbers, $6-7 million bucks a year in taxes that wouldn't otherwise be there? I think the exemption is a good investment. You should keep it. However, if it can't be kept, we're suggesting that leave the exemption in place for the next bylaw period so that people who are in the pipe can stay in the pipe and not have their financial planning dashed. The suggestion that was made would work. That's a variation we would accept. The cost to you appears to be traditionally somewhere around $1 million bucks a year. Make the new bylaw clearly indicate that there's no guarantee that this exemption will survive. So just like the downtown exemptions for Kitchener, if you open the bylaw and you're interested in what the rules are, it tells you don't count on this thing being here in 5 years. That's fair to give people notice, especially when you're dealing with such an important issue, such large numbers, and such an uncertain things as cleaning up sites. And I still recommend that the TIG program be strengthened by adding a cost of money. I understand that may not sound right politically, but in real life, the cost of money is just as much a cost as the cost of hiring bulldozers. And if we're going to eliminate the exemption, then a TIG program with a fair cost of money in it, I think the industry would be satisfied to say that's a fair transition in 5 years.
Right,
those are my comments.
Thank you, Mr. Robson. That's right at the end of your time. I appreciate that. I'm just wondering if staff can confirm the one point from Mr. Robson about the program and the building permit expiry.
Through the chair. So as part of a complete application, a building permit is not required, and that's true for the transition regs. In certain situations where you're doing a site-specific risk assessment, sometimes as you go through the remediation process, you're required to pull, say, a foundation permit. When you pull a foundation permit, development charges are triggered, and so the property owner is paying development charges. What that provision is actually catching is if you haven't had the ability to get your RSC completed and provide us with all the eligible costs, but you've pulled a building permit and paid DCs under this bylaw, then you're still eligible. So it's a little bit more flexibility for those that have paid DCs under the current bylaw, because when you pull the building permit, you have to pay them.
Okay. Mr. Dyer, you want to add on? Good. All right. Thank you, Mr. Robson.
Could I?
You
I
have
know
a
it's-
question for the delegation?
Yeah.
We have a question. Councillor Harris?
Good afternoon, Craig. You talked about the size parcel of land, the threshold of 10 hectares. I mean, there are a limited amount of sites perhaps in the region that would qualify for that. Are there other comparisons or other communities that reduce that size, parcel size? And say if you go to 5 or 7 even, is it going to capture a whole bunch more sites that are out there that are more likely to be within our region?
I'm not aware of any other community doing that. I haven't researched the other communities. We were concentrating pretty much on here. I think it's I haven't seen it anywhere else. I think that was our submission to say that, maybe that hasn't been focused on other places, but we were noticing these large contaminated sites were having a lot of trouble achieving the redevelopment allowance, and understood the concern that you wouldn't necessarily want to open up the doors for the 2-acre townhouse site to have a 20-year time period. That just was probably biting off way more than anyone wanted to chew. But by going with the larger sites that are contaminated, we were trying to limit the effect, make it very focused. With a 20-year limit, I think that's fair. 10 hectares, of course, is an arbitrary number. We recognize that as an arbitrary number. But, small, we would obviously like smaller, but I don't want to try to ask for too much and get told no on everything. So I'm trying to walk a razor blade here a little bit. And I would like to have some clarification on that building permit, because that's not how I read Section 17.
So what I would suggest with respect to that is Michelle contact you directly and you can have a discussion. I think it's being interpreted 2 different ways. So I think Michelle and you can connect and clarify.
Thank you very much.
No, thank you. Okay, Tim Collins. Welcome, Mr. Collins.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair and Committee.
It's good to follow Mr. Robson. I'm not going to go into some generalities of the program. We did make submissions earlier on in March, and we're part of the earlier stakeholder committee. I'm representing 83 Elmsdale. We are brownfield developers that do brownfields all over Ontario, and I'd like to maybe build upon some of what Mr. Robson said and sort of talk specifically about our site and how we really don't fit into any one of these sort of pockets of the new program or the old program. We purchased the site in 2012, and a majority of the remediation was completed in 2015. So we have soil issues as well as groundwater issues. Our original estimates for remediation were around $10 million, and we are in the ground for $10 million today. However, we have, like I said, groundwater issues and have to go through a risk assessment process. So on the ground right now, the site is remediated. It looks like the other side of the moon. There's wells all over the site. Over the last 5 years, we've gone through 5 resubmissions with the Ministry of Environment. Every submission has a 16-week review period with the ministry, and we still haven't received a record of site condition. To that point, too, we've been carrying those remediation costs for the last 4 years, and we have a cost associated with that. Eventually, our plans are for 500 plus homes, which will have its own sort of absorption period. So when you're looking from the time of our investment from the start to when we actually pulled building permits and that DC exemption is monetized is potentially 15 years. The new bylaw, the $1 million cap, it would bankrupt us. We would have no choice but to appeal the bylaw. We've based our investment under an understanding of, basically having our development charges exempt. The grandfathering, we don't really fit in because we don't have an RSC. We have our costs. We can easily, produce a report and an audit that fits, what their requirements are, but I don't have an RSC, nor if the building permit is a requirement, nor will I be able to pull a building permit. I'll be submitting building permits for the next 5 years. Another sort of complicated matter is when we applied for our TIF agreement, so we do have an executed TIF agreement by the city and the region, they estimated what our DCs were at that time. They estimated that our DC exemption would be $3.5 million. Therefore, and the way the program works is remediation costs minus your DCs and your TIF. That report got carried into our actual TIF agreement. So now our TIF agreement is capped based on a calculation a number of years ago of 3.5 million. So if that 3.5 million goes down, we could have potentially, based on our development model, gotten up towards 10 million in a TIF, but we're capped at 7 because of a calculation that was done a number of years ago on that. So, there's no mechanism in the agreement to say that if the DCs go down, the TIFs go up. So it's kind of we're if there's that $1 million, we're going to get it sort of twice in terms of trying to capture this $10 million that we originally were investing. So I'm supportive of a grandfathering clause. I don't think that we'll be able to develop or submit something by the end of this bylaw. I do know in other municipalities they have been able to work beyond the approval of the bylaw to work with an exemption. In Niagara, they did do that. So they approved the bylaw and we worked with council to develop an exemption beyond the approval there. And that's, really for us is, we understand that the programs need to evolve, they need to change. Brownfields are becoming more commonplace. I do say though, what is a brownfield 5 years ago? A lot of the stuff went from traditional dig and dumps to now everything's got, groundwater issues. It became, early on very easy to do. And now, like for us to do a risk assessment, it's a major undertaking with a lot of risk. And I think that, the the sites out there that have, benefited from this program were sort of the low-hanging fruit, and that there's going to be a lot of issues moving forward that we don't even know of. I think there's reports by the National Roundtable and the Green Municipal Fund about, if there's 1,000 brownfields in Ontario, the true number is like 100,000. There's going to be issues that are, in sites, some of these larger sites that, groundwater that is going to cost lots and lots of time and money to deal with, such as our site. There's a giant plume running underneath it. So again, yeah, we're supportive of a grandfathering. The tight timelines that we won't be able to fit into that, and we would be just liking the opportunity to, however that needs to work, what information that we need to give them to show them that we are a true brownfield, and to make the investment, you're going to get. Our projection is $1 million a year in regional taxes from our 500 plus units and commercial. So, I think that it's a worthwhile opportunity. So, thank you. If there are any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Collins. We do have a question. Chair Redmond.
Hi, I'm over here.
Hi.
Thanks very much for coming. I sort of have two questions. So, have you done a record of site condition?
No, we've submitted for it. So there's two different ways to get a record of site condition. You can go through a generic process where you clean up a site to a set table issued by the Ministry of Environment, and then you file a record of site condition. We have groundwater issues. We cannot meet the generic tables, so we have to go through what's called a risk assessment, which is a dynamic sort of process of looking at what the contaminants are there and what the potential end users are. And then that's when you would have a certificate of proper use with risk measures, so potentially capping the site, methane venting, etc. So we physically have done the remediation. The soil has been excavated, remediated. The groundwater has exceedances in it. So when we go and we drill a monitoring well and we take samples, we're not meeting the ministry's set criteria. Right. So we have to go through what's called a risk assessment. The risk assessment gets approved. Then you develop a risk certificate of property use that gets registered on title, that has risk measures that myself or any future owner would have to abide by. And with that, you get the record of site condition. So I don't have a record of site condition now, but I've done the remediation.
But you've clearly talked to staff at the region, so is your sense that you're in the queue currently?
Yeah, we've talked with them, but I don't meet their specific criteria of what we've talked about in terms of, making a complete application. I would not have all the documentation to make a complete application. But I have my cost, but I don't have my record of site condition.
Have you started the process?
Yeah, we've talked with them, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
And how far away are you in terms of years you think before a record of site condition?
I mean, I would be, I've probably said this 1,000 times to our consultants and our investors, and, I would hope that I'd have it by the end of the summer, but I'm subject to the Ministry of Environment. I've gone through 5 different submissions, 5 different reviews. Our risk assessment has been approved.
Okay.
But now we're developing the certificate of proper use and the risk measures.
Right.
So
you got another hurdle to overcome before you get the record.
Exactly, and then they register. Then there's the record of site condition, and gets approved, and there's a notice period and paperwork that has to go with that. So it could be a couple, months. It could be another year.
Okay, fair enough. Thanks for your candor. Appreciate that. And no further questions.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, Alicia Monteith. Welcome.
Thank you. Chair and members of the committee and members of the public here. My name is Alicia Monteith. I'm an urban planner for Prica Global Enterprises. As you may recall, I was the last presenter at the last meeting. So I will try to keep my comments as brief as I did that night. So we are writing again, and I'm here this evening on behalf of the company to express concerns with the bylaw. So now we've brought forward the bylaw and we're reviewing the draft, and I understand that you have the opportunity to make amendments as you see fit. So the letter that we had submitted is included in your package as part of page 4A, I believe. And I'll go through that letter, and in particular, we've recommended some sort of amendments, several amendments to the bylaw for your consideration this evening. I'm happy to, and I've included justification, I'll go through that, but I'm happy to answer any questions or clarification that you may have of our recommendations and why we're recommending what we are. So previously, our comments focused primarily on residential housing, and specifically residential housing and rental housing and affordability. So we still remain of the opinion that the increases will impact the ability for landowners to efficiently and effectively respond to market conditions. And that will influence the form of development throughout the region and impact current and future members of the community. So it was reiterated to members of the community that the values identified at the previous meeting were the maximum allowable values noted. I know there was quite a bit of perhaps discontent or miscommunication in that regard, but I would note that for the most part, the steering committee has recommended that you're proceeding with the maximum allowable values for the predominant number of values here. So that's something that I believe we've all shared concerns in the increase just from the rates that are applicable today to the rates that will be applicable as of August 1st and how quickly that turnaround time is. So we acknowledge obviously that development charges are necessary and growth needs to pay for growth, and we need to offset those costs, and as developers we need to work in that partnership to provide the services to the community, and that there is a responsibility to provide those services to ensure that everything is in working order for residential, commercial, institutional, all the types of development. However, the rates noted in the development charges bylaw predominantly reflect the maximum allowable value, and on average are about a 29% increase from what we see to this day. So that increase that we're seeing across the board has significant impacts on our projects that are in the pipeline. So as we've heard from us previously and as members of my colleagues in the area, the development projects take anywhere from 2 to 10, 15, 20 years to being obviously best case scenario that we're really not seeing all much anymore because of the intensification, the redevelopment of properties. Development is more complex. So what we're doing from the acquisition to the payment of building permits, that time, that lag time, increasing the bylaw this much in such short order has a drastic impact on performas and financial obligations that were established even 2 years ago or a year ago, 3 years ago, but more substantially for the projects that have been holding and waiting for these type of approvals. As has been discussed at length here, of course, is Bill 108 and how that will impact. So what we've done is taken a review of Bill 108, and we wanted to suggest to the committee that they perhaps include or consider including a couple recommendations here. One being that regulations be included in the RDC bylaw that implement the payment of development charges in the annual installment program for rental, institutional, industrial, and commercial as laid out under Bill 108. However, we know that it hasn't been proclaimed, is not enforced in effect, and we're waiting on those regulations, but I'd like committee to have the opportunity to consider how beneficial that program would be to our community as a whole. The second being that regulations be included in the RDC bylaw that implement the payment for nonprofit housing, the 21 annual installment payments, and that regulations be included that sets out rules for the amount of development charge is determined based on the date of the application, either under the site plan approval, the zoning bylaw amendment, or the building permit as applicable. And this is beneficial in being able to proactively understand what charges will be impacting the development and make it more predictable. So allow us earlier in the process to accommodate the required charges and not have to come to you guys at this point in your review and say this is way too much at this point, like some of our projects are in jeopardy type thing, or we're changing our development, because that's what happens. And that's what we're seeing with our developments. That's what we're seeing with other members of the community, is that we need to go back and this type of significant change is having an actual impact on the number of units, the type of units, and the form of development that we're seeing. Should the committee and regional council choose to implement the RDC bylaw as recommended this evening, we would ask that committee consider allowing a transitional policy that the new rates would not come into effect until January 1st of 2020, and that the current rates under the current bylaw would be enforced in effect from the period of August 1st to the end of December. And that would allow us time and development industry time to react to any of the changes, to rejig some of our developments, and really be able to look at the costs and the impact and how our forms of development, because we have developments that are obtaining perhaps site plan approval right now but are not ready to go to building permit. And that being so far in the process in that regard has its impact. So if we can allow another 4 months, I believe that ends up being, just to accommodate that, I think that would be a fair gesture. So if the committee did not want to perhaps apply that throughout, we are asking that applications that are deemed complete under site plan zoning bylaw or a building permit, that they are grandfathered at this point in the same as noted from August to December. So for instance, if we've achieved site plan approval but our construction drawings are not ready to go for building permit yet, that we have another 4 months to fall under that category if you didn't want to provide an all-out exemption across the entire region for everything, but just recognize the applications that are in the pipeline that are refined or recognized at this point, and allow them to proceed. So that was the intent of those. We go into one of our last recommendations is I've noted, and we appreciate the opportunity to provide a 50% discount to applicable office developments in the urban growth centers. And I think that recognizes committee's intent to intensify our cities, to create the dense and the interactive spaces in our downtown cores. What we would suggest is that at this point, the committee have consideration for the major transit station areas. Similar to how a development charge exemption was granted for the downtowns, and the development that spurred, and the community that was created as a result of that, we would now like to see that type of program implemented in the major transit station areas to encourage viability, to encourage the live-work situation or the office situation, and those dense types of developments and redevelopment spur the redevelopment to support the viability of those transit options. As noted, the province, the region, and the city recognize major transit station areas as strategic growth areas, and by allowing a discount of whatever value we've recommended, 50, to match the discount for office development and major transit station areas, we've recommended, as I said, 50. However, whatever value you seem is appropriate, just to recognize that we need to perhaps spur and ensure that we are supporting the employment sector, not just industrial, but our tech, our next step, our technologies, and ensuring that those are on our major transit lines and can support the viability of those programs. So based on that, those were the recommendations that we had put through at this time, and we would ask that committee consider what we've proposed, and that we look forward to working with the committee as they move forward with passing the final bylaw.
Thank you very much, Ms. Monteith. Are there any questions for the delegation? Seeing none, thank you very much. But I would comment that, did you write this report? It's very thorough. This letter?
Yes.
It's very thorough.
Thank you.
You know a lot about development charges for sure, and the way that you've gone through all of these different
I've become a quick learner.
Yeah. And I would just say that, the first couple points you're asking basically for us to implement the recommendations from Bill 108 into this bylaw. And what we basically decided to do is that we're going to wait till Bill 108 comes along.
Yeah,
we're going to do what we need to do.
We understand that. We wanted to bring it forward for committee's consideration.
Okay.
Just with the action, like at this point since the last meeting, as you know, it's received royal assent. So we understand that it will be coming in. Those regulations or those provisions are in the Development Charges Act. They're not in the regulations thereafter
Right.
with regards to the CBC. So that's why we were looking at whether or not committee would consider implementing those or incorporating some sort of essence of those in their bylaw moving forward to help that transition for those specific uses.
Okay. Well, thank you very much
Understanding.
for a very thoughtful submission.
Thank you.
We do have a question.
Oh.
Actually, more for Mr. Dyer. Your presentation, you noted the whole grandfathering or delaying of the bylaw to a future date. What would be the mechanism for that, if at all, any? Would it be like a, yeah, I'll let you answer the question.
Yeah, through Mr. Chair. So just to clarify, you're referring to the bylaw as a whole?
Well, I mean, she talked about the delaying of the bylaw implementation until January 1st. So what would the mechanism be in order for that to happen?
Yep. So the existing development charge bylaw expires on July 31st.
Right.
So council needs to have a new bylaw in place as of August the 1st. That bylaw could provide for a phase-in, I'll use that term, of rates. And for example, if I understand the request, the bylaw could explicitly state that the new rates could come into effect at a later date. Right now, the bylaw is drafted in a way that the new rates would come into effect on August the 1st. If there is a preferred, I'll say, implementation date for the new rates that's different than August the 1st, then that can certainly be written into the bylaw. At the risk of sounding repetitive, to the extent that rates are charged at an amount less than the maximum permissible rate, we need to fund the difference. So we would need to make sure that we were able, again, that we would look to estimate what the cost of that phase-in would be and make sure that council had those numbers when it made that decision.
But in order to not have that happen, can this council just extend the existing bylaw date or change that without having to go down that more costly route?
So I don't believe so. I think the Act is quite specific that a development charge bylaw cannot live for longer than 5 years. So we have to, the current bylaw has to conclude on July 31st. We have to replace it with something.
Okay.
Right.
All right, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Alicia, thanks for coming in. Okay, we have 2 additional delegations at 10 minutes, then we have 4 or 5 at 5 minutes. So Glenn Scheels, welcome, Glenn.
Thank you, Chair and members of committee. I'll keep it to 5 minutes. You've heard from Craig Robson, and I think Craig did a great job summarizing the aspects with respect to the Brownfield program, and that's what I'm here to speak about as well. We work with many developers on redevelopment sites, and you're going to hear as well later on from Chris Pidgeon from our firm, and Chris is also going to highlight some of the sites and some of the projects we're working on. Certainly, I'm here tonight to speak as well, or more specifically perhaps, about the Auburn Development Project at Schneider's and also Reid's Heritage Homes. We're working with them on a new project, which is the redevelopment of the former Ontario Dye Company project in Waterloo at Roger and Moore. This is the 3rd time I've been here now to speak to you. I was here in March, May, June. Somehow I skipped April. I don't know. Was there no meeting in April? So you've heard my message, and again, I don't need to repeat it all other than to say that, you know, the program that you have today, as Craig highlighted, has certainly been very valuable. It's led to a lot of positive change, especially in the older parts of our cities. And, you know, it's certainly part of dealing with that transformation that we have. We were a manufacturing community. We've got a lot of older industrial sites, and there's a legacy with them. And this is really part of a broader city building strategy that's led to these sites being cleaned up in many cases sooner rather than later. It's provided for new residential and office development in very central locations where there is pretty good infrastructure in many cases already, and where we're creating new transit systems. And It's also generated a lot of new tax revenue on sites that were somewhat idle, I'd call it, beforehand. So, the redevelopment of the Schneider site, for example, it's going to be a mixed-use project. There's probably going to be 240 or 250 100,000 square feet of commercial space, and as planned now, something in the order of 2,800 residential units. So at full build-out, and that certainly is sometime down the road, but at full build-out, there's probably going to be in the order of $10 million in taxes generated on that project. So there certainly is a lot of money being developed through these brownfield sites. And Craig highlighted, what the situation has been to date in terms of investment and assessment growth. So I think now we're dealing with a transition, and the issue now is one of fairness and how to transition out of an exemption program, if that is your desire. Again, both Reid's with the ODC project and Auburn with Schneider's have purchased these properties some time ago. And they purchased them, with the program in place and based many decisions on that program continuing on. So in both cases, demolition has occurred. A lot of testing has taken place as well. Site remediation is in process now, but an RSC is just not in the works. It's not going to happen by July 31 this year. Similar to what Mr. Collins indicated, it takes a lot of time. There's submissions and resubmissions, and, in both of those cases, if you talk to the environmental consultants, they're quite optimistic. They can get approvals or an RSC in place in 2 years, but sometimes that doesn't happen, and it becomes 3 years, 4 years to realize that. And so to crystallize a program as it is today by July 31 just is not going to happen. So based on that, there's two aspects, item 2F and 2G. 2F is the redevelopment allowance, and that has been extended, and we're certainly supportive of that. As Craig indicated, it's worth considering maybe on those larger sites, extending it from 15 years perhaps out to 20 years. I don't think there's any harm to the region in doing that. The more we can use the development, or what I call the demolition credit, the redevelopment allowance, the less need there is for an exemption or other programs. So I think it's worth considering. And then with respect to 2G, that's the Brownfield Financial Incentive Program. Our request is the same as the last time I spoke, and that is to continue that program for another 5 years so that these projects that are in the works now will have benefit to that program. When you transitioned out of the downtown exemption, the industry had a clear warning. It was in all the documents that this program was going to end at a certain date, and you have got 5 years to, take advantage of it. So that kind of approach, I think, is fair and reasonable. Mayor Verbanovic, in his questions earlier, suggested maybe another approach to grandfathering and coming up with some other mechanism to get these projects that are now well underway, but certainly not across the goal line, to get them grandfathered. And we're certainly in support of looking at that. And our team can be available at any time to sit down and talk about those possibilities. Certainly on each of those projects, there's work programs prepared. There's cost estimates in place. We've got development concepts. We can tell you how many square feet and how many units we're looking at. So if we can find some way to work through that, that's certainly something that we're more than prepared to sit down and talk about. So those are my comments to you. Less than 10 minutes, Mr. Chair. And
Okay, thanks very much, Glenn, and thanks for coming back again.
Okay.
We have no questions, so thanks so much.
Thanks.
Okay, Mark Kindrachuk. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you for having me again.
I think this is your third trip too.
I think it is.
Yeah.
I'll go through this quickly. I like pictures. The focus of my presentation is going to be on fairness, competitiveness, and resolving what I think is an unintended consequence. And really one of the big things here, I'll go through this point by point. The existing method for calculating industrial DCs, which is important to us, is up there, industrial versus non-industrial, which is in the regional handout and is really important. What hasn't been stated in a lot of the prefaces is it got unilaterally changed in the new DC bylaw report. So there was the first question, why did it get changed? It wasn't in the executive summary on June 7th. And then we try to live with it, but it's got a massive difference and a hugely punitive impact on industrial development charges. So the new method is uniform, but it's grossly unfair to industrial development, which I think is an unintended consequence, but it's the reality. The second thing is the amended report, as we talked about last time I was here, called about a discount to a maximum permissible, which is fine, but it kept a different method of using this uniform. So my analogy is, which I'll go through in detail with numbers, is like taking one step forward with the 50% discount and two big steps back with changing the methodology. Massive impact on industrial DCs, very favorable to office, retail, and institutional, but it's a big problem. So for us, we think there's a resolution to it. There's a precedent we see as well, but I want to walk you through really the background. This is an important document. This is a summary of the region, and there's two big headings there. It's industrial versus non-industrial. So for the last 5 years, this is what all the developers, investors have been using. It's the rule book. It got changed completely without any explanation on June 7th. The recommendation said, let's go uniform. So look at the two numbers at the bottom. There's two big numbers. There's the 609 and the 1218. Those are two hugely important numbers. So the 609 was what industrial was, and then the balance of what they say non-residential went up to 1219. This is a picture that really shows the impact. The purple you'll see is the DCs, 1218. And there's really 4 pillars. This is like DC 101. In commercial DCs, there's office, which is on the left. There's institutional, which you see is really university buildings. There's retail, like malls. And then on the right-hand side, there's industrial, which is like manufacturing facilities. So those are the 4 different types of non-residential. And then you can see we've put in a scale showing the cost of the buildings and then how it affects the DCs. Because when you build a building, and I'll give you an example of all 4, because I think this is really important to understand. When you build an office building in downtown Kitchener, it's going to cost you $250. Well, you can amortize $12 over $250 because you've got more building to amortize it over, and your rents are $26. So you can afford to pay $12. The next column, you go to a university building. You build a new building at the University of Waterloo. I got costs from contractors, costs $250 a square foot. Again, you can amortize $12 over it because you've got a bigger bulk of building to amortize per square foot. You go to retail, if you're doing suburban, and I do suburban retail, it costs about $150, but you get $30 in rent. You can again afford to pay $12. It's just common sense. That's why it was set up this way. Now you go on the right-hand side, you go to industrial. It costs $110 to build an industrial building. You're only getting $6.50 in rent. You can only afford to pay $6 on a DC. It's common sense. You can't afford to pay double that because it's twice your rent. So that's why it was set up this way, very logically, very practically, in place for 5 years. So June 7th comes along, changes everything. Now here's the new method. Again, and here's the key numbers. in the report, it has two options. It has a uniform and it has the industrial versus non-industrial. Well, in the new report, it says industrial should be paying $942. You see it on the right-hand side? It also says the office should be paying $1875, the institutional should pay $1875, and the retail should be $1875. And you see that 2-to-1 ratio? It's consistent. But now they put inside, okay, but it's uniform, let's blend them all. So what that means is all the three on the left, the office, the institutional, and retail go down $2.68 to the common $16.07. Lo and behold, what happens to the industrial? We go up $6.65. So now it's blended across the board to $16.07. So what that is doing is the industrial is subsidizing the other three groups. So I look at that and go, it wasn't indicated in the executive summary. It wasn't Shane didn't describe that. This is a massive difference. So the one step forward, you discounted it 15%, but you jacked it up $9.42 before you did it. And it's based on the numbers in your report. So by changing the calculation method, you've made it hugely punitive to industrial. So how does that affect going forward? Well, look at the DCs as a percentage of our rent. We're only getting $6 a rent, frankly, in this whole region on industrial, but we've been asking to pay $16 in rent or $18. Even though it's a discount, it's more than that. As a percentage construction cost, it's only $110 to build a building, but we're being pulled up to the other guy's levels. So it's hugely punitive to use this new calculation for industrial. So we don't believe that's fair, number one. Then we go back, and we've been at this for frankly 12 years. This is from, frankly, the Regional Growth Management Strategy. 16 years ago, as Helen said, 2003, the cornerstone of the prosperity in this region, 5,000 jobs based on this report, is there. And you've thrown us underneath the bus with the raise in development charges, which I think is unintended, but it's the reality, what this report says. So you've discounted it 15% after you raised it from six more bucks. So we look at this and we say, the first part's not fair. The second part is not competitive. So we're dealing with institutional investors right now. They're looking at Cambridge, they're looking at Woodstock, they're looking at Guelph. And right now it's the DCs are $14.91 for industrial, which is 5 million square feet out there in the East Side lands, which has been worked on for 16 years. And we're not competitive. After 16 years, here's where we're at. Guelph is at $12.37, Brantford's at $7, Woodstock's at $0. So we've worked 16 years, unintended consequences for this change, which wasn't identified in the executive summary, wasn't even identified by Shane, half an hour ago, has a massive effect. So I look at your recommendation, I look at two things, paragraph 2C and 2D. Well, 2D, you've taken into consideration a 50% discount of non-resident development for office and urban growth. Makes sense. We understand it's intensification, LRT, fully support that, makes sense. But your precedent is the downtown office gets benefit of the 50% reduction, okay, and also the advantages of the uniform rate, brand new. We look at it, if we take the punitive uniform rate, we should get the benefit of the 50% reduction and an additional reduction to level the playing field. And the irony of it is, no new development charges, just have us subsidize less institutional or retail. I don't know why we'd be subsidizing Fairway Park or Conestoga Mall on the retail. Why would we be subsidizing our DCs for them, for the industrial job base? So when I look at this, what we're suggesting is we can balance this out, just have industrial subsidize less. I think this is an unintended consequence, but it's real. We've got two big investors looking at this going, we can't make this work because it's unfair. So that's our perspective on an unintended consequence that came about with the unilateral change, which wasn't even identified earlier today, on the huge difference the calculation method makes. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Mark, and you're right on time. And so your request is actually something that I think that Councillor Jowett is contemplating. And we earlier, when you were here, we requested staff to crunch some numbers to see how much that will cost. So that's in the process, and we'll get that information before we go into debate on the main motion.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, Mr. Dyer would like to make a comment.
So if I may, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to speak, I wouldn't want any councillor to leave today thinking that there was anything new introduced with respect to our treatment of non-residential development charges. That is absolutely not what has happened. And, in terms of the remarks that Shane made, Shane presented the development charges, I believe, in an accurate manner. And I'm just quite concerned that, and we're going to have to, I assume, follow up with a discussion with the delegation, because what was presented here was not accurate. And I can point you to two pages to look at. One would be page 18 of the agenda, which shows the recommendation on non-residential rates, and I'll read it. Set the non-residential development charge rates in the development charge bylaw at the rates described in the 2019 recommended uniform column. So there has been no change to how, to the treatment of the rates themselves. And I don't know if it's possible to get slide 13 from Mr. Fedy's slides back up on the screen. If that's possible, then that slide would show that in both the current and in the proposed rates, and so I'll point you to the middle row first of all, the current RDC rate, $12.18 across the board, with a $6.09 rate for industrial, benefiting from the 50% reduction. In the case of the recommended rates, I would say $16.07 across the board, but a 15%, again, the continuation of the 50% reduction on industrial and the introduction of a 50% adjustment for qualifying office. And so the recommended approach to the treatment of non-residential rates has not changed. Basically what we're saying is continue the policy that you've had in place for the last 5 years, which is a 50% reduction for industrial, and introduce a 50% discount for qualifying office. Thank you.
Okay, so we appreciate the clarification, Mr. Dyer, but we really don't want to get into a debate with the delegation, so it's kind of like point, counterpoint. So I think it would be best, as per your suggestion, that staff follow up with the delegation and have a conversation about the uniform rate and how it's calculated and how it's being positioned and how we believe that it's been fair and accurate. And I'm sure Mr. Kindrachuk will have a different perspective of that, but at least the two of you will be talking. Okay. So let's move on now. That we have 5 delegations, I believe, 5 minutes each. So the first one is Jennifer Meader. Welcome, Jennifer. So Jennifer, I noticed you're on here for 2 separate matters. So you're gonna go 5 and 5? You're allowed to. I just wanted to clarify that, that's all.
Okay, thank you,
Yeah,
sir.
okay, all right, great.
Mr. Chair and members of committee, again, my name is Jennifer Meader. I'm a lawyer at Turkstra Mazza Associates, And first, I'm here on behalf of the Waterloo Region Home Builders Association. On behalf of the association, we'd first just like to thank the region for allowing us the opportunity to participate in the review process that will lead to ultimately the passing of a new DC bylaw. The association retained Daryl Kelleher, a land economist with Altus Group, to assist in the review process. And it has been an iterative process between the region and the association, and the most recent iteration being responses received from staff yesterday to a number of inquiries from Mr. Kelleher. And it appears at this stage that many of the association's inquiries have been addressed. However, there are two key concerns that remain outstanding. The first is the apparent lack of deduction that has been made for excess capacity for the transit system. And the second concern is the portion of the costs that have been attributed to existing development for certain projects. That's the benefit to existing, also known as BTE. The portion of the cost attributed to BTE appears to be substantially low, given the nature and/or the geographical context of some of those projects. Such projects include many of the roads included in the transportation program, as well as projects labeled facility upgrades, regulatory requirements upgrades, and rural infrastructure upgrades in the water and wastewater programs. So on behalf of the association, we're simply asking that the region take a more detailed review of the excess capacity for transit and the BTE for those projects. And of course, the association would be happy to assist in any more detailed review that the region is willing to undertake. Subject to any questions, that concludes my delegation for the association.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. We have no questions, but just heard from Mr. Dyer that staff have been in conversation with the home builders and on this matter with respect to existing benefits to under transit, that there's a difference of opinion.
In terms of the excess capacity issue on transit? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So there's a difference of opinion, and you're just restating the home builder's position, essentially.
Correct, sir, in respect of excess capacity, but there is a second issue that.
Sorry, you're right. I was blending the two together. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So now you want to go on to the second issue, St. John's Kilmarnock School?
Yes, thank you, sir.
All right.
St. John's Kilmarnock School, also known as SJK, is an independent nonprofit school for students in junior kindergarten up through grade 12. SJK's campus is located on Shant Station Road within the community of Breslau and the township of Woolwich. The campus is privately serviced for water, wastewater, and stormwater. As I believe this committee or the broader council is aware, SJK is proposing to construct a recreational facility on its campus, which will be privately funded and operated. Programming for the facility will focus on youth hockey and particularly on girls hockey. The facility will be centrally located within the region by virtue of its location on SJK's property, and it will be available for public use during a significant portion of its operating hours. We did submit correspondence this morning that relates to this delegation. I'm not sure if the clerk had an opportunity to distribute it or if any members of committee had an opportunity to review it. I do have copies if that is of assistance or required.
It's being distributed, and I think it's in our agenda today, but is there, like, we've dealt with this matter previously and we denied the request for a waiver of development charges, right?
Correct, sir. My understanding is that there was a request for an exemption, and what I'm here today to request is that through the review of the whole DC bylaw, which is being undertaken, which is the subject of this meeting, that the committee and council consider an exemption directly in the DC bylaw for a specific type of school.
Oh, okay. All right.
So in my submission, such an exemption would be written, could be written directly into either Section 3, subsection 4A of the proposed bylaw, or Section 3, subsection 4C of the proposed bylaw. And we need to be clear that exactly what we're asking the region to exempt. We're not asking the region to exempt private schools from the payment of DCs. SJK does not operate as a typical private school. Instead, SJK is asking that only independent nonprofit schools be exempt. Independent schools are distinct from private schools in that the former is not for profit and the latter is for profit. And so more specifically, we are respectfully requesting that any school be exempt from the payment of DCs only if it meets 4 specific criteria. Again, I think these could be written directly into the bylaw. The first is that the school has to be a co-ed independent school. Secondly, that it be non-profit. Third, that it is a member of the Conference of Independent Schools of Ontario. And fourth, that it is a member of the Canadian Accredited Independent Schools. And I think it's of interest to this committee to note that SJK is the only school in the region that exists today that would meet all 4 of those criteria. So the amount of construction that would benefit from the proposed exemption is extremely limited. It's understandable that the region would levy DCs against profit-driven non-residential development, such as private schools, but again, SJK is not a private school. It is non-for-profit, and it is, in my submission, more akin to a public school, which is fully exempt from the payment of DCs. So in my submission, independent schools should be given similar treatment under the region's DC regime to public schools. As a general note, the purpose of development charges, which is set out in Section 2 of the DC Act, is to pay for increased capital costs required because of increased need for services arising from development. And generally, background studies prepared in support of DC bylaws, and the background study prepared in support of this proposed DC bylaw in particular, estimate future development in terms of new residents and jobs coming into the region. And in this case, it's not anticipated that the construction of additional buildings on the SJK campus, including the recreational facility, will result in increased residents or jobs. Consequently, any future improvements to the SJK campus would not constitute development, as that term is used in the context of development charges. Furthermore, any future construction, including the recreational facility, will be accessory in nature to the principal use, will operate on private services, as I indicated, and will not place any additional burden on regional services. Consequently, the proposed exemption will not result in an increase in the need for services arising from development. The DC Act allows for types of development to be exempt from the payment of DCs on a general basis, as is being proposed by SJK and respective independent schools, so long as any resulting shortfall is not imposed against other types of development. In those cases, the shortfall is put on the backs of the taxpayers. However, as I've just stated, any new construction on SJK's campus will not increase the population or employment in the region, and likewise will not increase the need for services. The proposed exemption would apply to a very discrete use, independent schools, which will not impact the ability to provide services, and which was not expressly contemplated by the background study. Again, the proposal would not add any commercial GFA to the region. It would not add any industrial GFA to the region that would increase the need for services. It would not add any residential units that would increase the need for services. And as a result, there will be no shortfall in funding for the tax base to bear. And as an alternative to the proposed exemption, this does go beyond the purpose of this particular meeting. And it's, to be clear, we're not asking for an exemption. As an alternative, we're asking that the region perhaps consider entering into a late payment agreement with SJK, which would make the DCs for the rec facility payable upon the selling of the facility to a third party. This approach will not establish a precedent in my submission. Again, that is because SJK can be distinguished from private schools, and it's the only facility of its kind in the region. And while the late payment agreement will not establish a precedent, there is precedence available to the region for entering into late payment agreements with independent schools. One known example is an existing late payment agreement between York Region and St. Andrews College for the build-out of its campus in Aurora. And in that case, there was quite a substantial amount of construction associated with their site plan. And I am aware of other examples as well. As a recreational facility targeted to girls hockey, the facility promotes health and well-being, which are key objectives of this region, and it will instill confidence in young female athletes. The facility will have these impacts not only on the SJK students, but on the broader region, considering that the facility will be available for public use. And furthermore, I think it's of great significance that this facility falls within a category of service that is financed through the township's DC. The township is exempt from the payment of regional DCs, including for the construction of any recreational facilities. So it's counterintuitive in my submission that SJK would be required to pay DCs on the facility when it will add to the service base and lower the burden on municipal facilities. In other words, the facility will decrease the need for services, to use the language from Section 2 of the Act. It will not increase it. The recreational facility will add to the service base despite the fact that the facility will be privately financed and will not be included in the township's DC bylaw. There's an obvious fairness issue that the region has an opportunity to address through a late payment agreement. And finally, it's worth noting that the facility will have limited, if any, impact on regional services. Again, the facility is not increasing the need for services, as it will not increase employment or population, and it will rely on private water, sanitary, and storm sewers and the existing road network. Subject to any questions, that concludes my delegation.
Okay, thank you very much. We do have a question. Councillor Foxton.
Thank you, and through the chair. So one of the things you're requesting is that development charges be deferred until you sell the property.
That is the alternative proposal.
And selling the property, you would do at a profit or break even. So you are, therefore, it is a profit for your school. You're using it as a profit.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. In the event of a sale of the property in its entirety or some portion of it, yes, there would presumably be market value associated with that, and presumably the DCs that would be triggered at that time would be factored into the purchase price. But there's no intention for the facility to be sold. That's just, that proposal models the existing late payment agreement between St. Andrew's College and the region of York.
But your first part of your presentation constantly spoke about you not being a not-for-profit, and then you put this caveat in, which, should we put it in, opens the door to allow you to profit.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'm not sure selling a property for its market value is a form of profit. It's not the business that SJK is in. There would be a profit associated with the sale of land.
So it is a profit, though. Thank you. I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
In nonprofit world, you can have an excess of revenue over expenses, but it's still not a profit as per a private business, right? So thank you, Ms. Meader, for coming in. I would suggest on the late payment option that you follow up with staff. That's something that I think we've only done possibly once in the history of the region. But of course, depending on the timing of the construction, if Bill 108 comes into place, you'll still have 6 years to pay the development charges on the new facility.
Thank you, sir.
Right. Okay, thank you. Marcus Good, peopleCare. Welcome, Marcus.
Thank you, Chair Strickland and members of committee. Juliana Constantine, my colleague, was going to speak today and wasn't feeling so well, so I'm speaking on her behalf. If there are any questions, perhaps she can assist with that. So thank you for giving us time to speak today. We are here to represent peopleCare Group, Inc., Crescent Care, Twin Oaks of Maryhill, and Schlegel Villages. We have already shared our policy brief regarding the development charge background study and bylaw review. We are recommending development charge exemption for long-term care and retirement homes in the region. We have 5 points we would like to highlight today as to why we are asking for these exemptions. Despite the growing need, access to long-term care remains a real issue, with wait times increasing at an astounding rate. As of February 2019, 35,000 Ontarians were waiting for long-term care, and the average time for placement was over 160 days. This wait list is expected to double or triple in the next 5 to 10 years unless the demand can be met. Number two, long-term care homes are similar to hospitals in that they both provide essential health services. Yet hospitals, as defined in the Public Hospitals Act, are currently included in the exempted services of the Provincial Development Charges Act. Number 3, in municipalities such as County of Huron, Oxford, Grey Bruce counties, long-term care and retirement homes pay no development charges. Number 4, long-term care is often the only affordable, low-cost option for seniors who require care. More than 40% of long-term care beds qualify for rate reductions based on residents' income. In addition, long-term care is 60% funded by the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care. Point number 5, long-term care homes are not considered residential for tax purposes and are therefore paying much higher taxes, almost double that of a residential property. Again, we respectfully recommend the exemption of development charges as it relates to regional bylaws for long-term care homes as defined in the Long-Term Care Homes Act 2007 and retirement homes as defined by the Retirement Homes Act 2010 within the region of Waterloo. Thank you. Those are our comments.
Well, thank you very much, Marcus, and well under your 5 minutes, so we certainly do appreciate that, and do appreciate the points that you've made. We've also received correspondence over the past number of weeks from your group and the others that you mentioned, so thank you very much.
Thank
you. Chris Pidgeon. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Chair and regional councillors. I'll be brief. Most of the comments from the delegations we're in support of. I submitted a letter yesterday, and I hope it's been circulated to council. Okay, thank you. So that letter included 5 letters from developers. They included Auburn Developments, Hilco, who is the owner of Kraus Flooring, Momentum Developments, Rockway Holdings, and the Zaire Group of companies. And these developments, I've listed the developments under each of the developer headings. So these developments collectively have played a significant role, I would say, in changing the urban landscape in Kitchener and Waterloo. And I want to give committee a sense of timing. So the Barrel Yards project was approved or started in 2004. Auburn Developments purchased it in 2004. Jamie Kreit signed the development agreement in 2008. So 4 years later, we had our approvals. But the first building permit was not issued until 2012. And the reason was that the record of site condition took an additional 3 years to secure. And then there was a 4th year, so the 4th year was working through the building permit process. So it gives committee a sense of the timing of these environmental audit and review processes with the province, particularly for very large sites. So many of these projects that I've listed in my letter are well known to council. Kraus Flooring is in the middle of their environmental audit process. You're aware of what's happening with that site. It has 1 million square feet of building space. We certainly appreciate the extension on the timeline for the redevelopment allowance. However, the RDC exemption has been factored in to Hilco's overall pro forma. Many of these pro formas take into account about a 5-year timeline from the time that they initiate those environmental audits until they secure the record of site condition and redevelopment approvals. I simply want to highlight there are many other projects that committee is not aware of. I've listed them, some of them on page 2. So the E&E Signaler contractor yard on Charles Street, we've been working on that site. The environmental work is ongoing. Kraus Flooring, I've already mentioned. Swan Dust Control in the city of Waterloo. And there are a number of other projects, including Airboss in Kitchener, a very large redevelopment site opportunity, Ontario Seed Company, the Swanson Home Hardware. And I just came from a meeting on the Preston Springs Hotel in Cambridge. These are very large, complex, significant urban landscape changers for our region. We respectfully request that the existing program that's in place under the existing bylaw be not extended, but it be adopted by committee and council for another 5-year period. Within that 5-year period, any one of these projects has fair warning to work through their environmental processes and secure their record of site condition so that they can benefit from the advantages and the incentives that have been put in place by the region of Waterloo. You've been a leader. These 5-year windows are really important for these large redevelopment projects. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris. I have no questions. Thank you. Jeff Robinson, Reid's Heritage Homes. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you, Chair, members of committee, staff. My name is Jeff Robinson. I'm a Senior Manager of Development with Reid's Heritage Homes. This is my first visit before this committee and council. Craig and Glenn have been working on our ODC site in Waterloo, which they've already spoken to a little bit. I know you've seen their faces several times here before. I'll try to keep my comments short, and I will touch base on our Ontario Dye Company site in a moment. Thank you again for letting me have the opportunity to speak tonight. I will limit my comments to the brownfield exemptions provisions of the proposed development charges bylaw. Just a quick background on our company. We have been a developer, builder of many communities across the region for over 40 years. Like many other builders within the region, we've really transitioned from a traditional greenfield suburban type developer to more of a core area infill and brownfield developer. We've had 2 projects in the past that you may be familiar with that have taken advantage of the brownfields program in the region. The first one being the former Canmet industrial site on Margaret Street in Cambridge, which we developed a number of years ago and is actually a LEED ND community, first one in Canada. And more recently and currently, we have a plan of subdivision on Munch Avenue in Cambridge, which is a former junkyard. And again, we've had the opportunity to take advantage of the brownfield program that has been in place under this current bylaw. It goes without saying the availability of this program has brought financial certainty and viability very early on in our due diligence of these projects. It's something that we assess when we're looking at all of the different opportunities and constraints of a project, and having that program in place has been a very large bonus and certainly played a major factor in our determination to proceed with those projects. And I can certainly say that those 2 sites, the Preston Meadows site and currently the Munch Avenue site, would not have progressed or been developed by our company if the brownfields program was not available for us to have access to. We are continuing to invest in the region's core areas with our current brownfield site, as we've talked about a little bit, at Roger Street and Moore Avenue in Waterloo. This is the former Ontario Dye Company site. This significant redevelopment is of a former industrial site in the Midtown area, and it will see a new residential community of 234 units, a public park, which we will be conveying to the city of Waterloo, and as well a parkette at the corner of Roger Street and Moore Avenue. As noted in the staff report, the $13.4 million in RDC exemptions and nearly $26 million in TIGs for projects across the region since the program has been in place have returned approximately $800 million increased assessment value. As our colleagues have noted, that's obviously been a very good return on investment for the region. Our Ontario Dye Company site in Waterloo on its own will result in an increased assessment value of approximately $65 million. And that number is based on a recent MPAC assessment of the estimated value of the property post-construction. This is not only a very good financial return on investment, but it's also a social, community, and environmental return on investment for both the City of Waterloo and the region, and of course the residents in that area. This significant redevelopment project will clean up an old industrial site, provides a range of housing. We're proposing stacked townhouses in varying sizes, as well as condominium apartment units. And it provides community benefits to this neighborhood. It's, as you likely know, this is a very established core area, older neighborhood in Waterloo, with a very old industrial building on the site that has led to contamination of the property. And we're excited about the opportunity to redevelop this site. The availability of the brownfields program was a critical component in assessing the viability of redeveloping the site. The financial go or no-go decisions that were made at our due diligence stage, which was approaching 2 years ago, was based on the availability of the brownfields program being available throughout the duration of the project, not just at the time of entering into due diligence and closing on the property, but obviously throughout the development cycle for the property. Our company would not have purchased the Ontario Dye Corporation site without the brownfield provisions under the current DC bylaw. In light of this current project status and timeframe, we do have several concerns with the proposed changes to the development charges bylaw before you.
Jeff, you're over your 5 minutes, so
Okay.
are you able to wrap up?
Yes, I can.
Give us
Chair.
absolutely. Give us your concluding remarks, sir. That'd be
Sure.
great. Thanks.
Really, our principal concern, we have two. One is the transition policy. And I know that has been subject of some dialogue tonight, and the July 31st date that has been defined as requiring a complete application and potentially building permits. I understand staff is going to take a look at and clarify the definition of that. This project is still in the earlier stages of the process. We're about to demolish the buildings and then immediately start a remediation process. So for this particular site, we're not in a position to have a record of site condition for likely 18 months to 24 months. That's really our principal concern. The provisions under the brownfield program have been very valuable. We certainly would like to see them continued for the next 5 years. And as my colleagues mentioned, if committee and council decide following that 5-year term that those programs are no longer viable, we're certainly okay with that. But we have, for our project and others that are already in the pipeline, we really need to rely on this program to carry out through remediation and ultimate development.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming in, and thanks for those comments. We really appreciate that. There are no questions from committee, so thank you. So what I'm going to propose is we've been at this for about 2.5 hours. We have a 10-minute recess, and we'll reconvene at approximately, in 10 minutes from now. All right? So, all right. A lot of numbers going on. I can't do the math. So like 6:38 or something like that. All right. Thank you. Okay. Thanks for your patience. I'd like to reconvene this special meeting of Administration and Finance Committee to deal with development charges. We took a little bit longer than we had thought due to some calculations that were requested with respect to a potential further reduction in the industrial rate. So what I'd like to say in terms of process is I've looked at this a bunch of different ways. It's one heck of a big motion on here. So I was debating whether or not we would move it all at once and then take different items separately and deal with the amendments. But what I think I'm going to do, just to keep it simple, is we'll just somewhat tediously go through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then deal with et cetera, and then deal with recommendations and amendments as they come up. Also recognizing that Councillor Foxton has declared a conflict on item G. Okay, so in terms of new information, Mr. Dyer, the request for what, additional 10 or 20% would cost on the industrial exemption.
Yep. So, thank you, Mr. Chair. So, based on some discussions that we've just had and our understanding of the overall amount of industrial development that could take place through the in the east side lands, we think that the impact of a 10% reduction on the industrial DC is somewhere in the $500,000 to $700,000 range. Now, we'd like to do a little bit more due diligence on that, but that's what our early numbers are telling us.
No, per year.
Per year.
Per year. No, Mr. Dyer, you want to clarify a little bit more how that calculation, now, there was 4 very smart people over there, not including me, trying to figure this out. So, Mr. Dyer, maybe you can give a little rationale as to what the formula was and how we arrived at that number.
Yep. So looking at the anticipated development within the east side lands, which would generate, I think, at the full rate in the area of $110 million of industrial development charges, then a 50% discount on that takes that down to about $55 million. So another 10% would take it down to around 44, so it would drop another $11 million. And if we assumed that the development was going to happen over, say, a 14 or 15 year period, then that would take us into the 700,000 range or so. Again, we'd like to prove it out. I think it's suggesting that, to a certain extent, that the amounts that we've got anticipated, that we had identified in the report, are maybe a little bit light on the cost of the industrial discount. But I think we were, in part assuming that, some of the development would start over the next couple of years, but, larger components would happen outside of this 5-year term of the bylaw. So it's a bit of a way of saying it's a bit of a moving target with a bunch of assumptions, and we'll try to prove that out certainly before council meets again next week.
Okay, so Councillor Vandenbeck, on this matter? Okay, Councillor Jaworski on this matter?
Thank you, through the chair. What do we classify a discount as? Is this an exemption, or is this going to be causing a reblending of the rate to rebalance to go to other properties? Are we going to be kept whole, or is this a true exemption that we have to pay?
Good, very good question. Mr. Dyer?
Yeah, very good question. Going back to my earlier comments that we're establishing a uniform rate across all forms of industrial development, of non-residential development, so commercial, industrial, institutional, all at the same rate, and then we're applying a 50%, this is actually a discount. We're discounting the rate to industrial and funding that discount through property taxes and user rates. That's correct. Yep. So whether it's 50 or 40 or 60, the funding source remains the same. Just the numbers change.
Okay. All right. So we're ready for the recommendations. A mover and seconder for number 1. Chair Redmond, Councillor Lawrence. Discussion, Councillor Urbanovic?
No. I'm number 2F and 2G.
Okay, all right. You really wanted to get in the queue early, didn't you? Oh, I appreciate that. Councillor Harris?
Yeah, I think we discussed perhaps we'll take these as separate votes. And is that what we agreed to?
Yeah.
Okay, if we can record them, that'd be great.
Okay. So all those in favor of number 1? Opposed? That's carried. Okay. Number 2, now you want to take 2, Barry, which 2 section what? I guess. Sorry, yeah. And Councillor Jowett, you want 2C, right? D, okay. Barry, go ahead.
So I have 2F sub 3 and 2G sub 2 bracket 2. The clerk has them, and I sent an email to everyone with them, so I'll just go through them if you want very quickly.
So why don't we just take A first and get that out of the way, right? So we're okay with 2A, right? So all those in favor? Opposed, if any, that's carried. Okay. Councillor Harris opposed. 2B, non-residential development charge rates, recommended column. Okay, B. Mover and seconder. Councillor Clark, Councillor Erb, all those in favor? That's carried. Okay. C, discount non-residential development to qualifying industrial development. So I think Helen, so put your, okay, hang on for a second. Put your request in to speak and I'll turn the mic on. That's okay.
Okay, so through the chair, to approve the 50% non-res charge rate established for, under the recommendation 2B, and amend to a further 15% for industrial lands, for industrial development, sorry. Is that what you're wanting? Have I got that kind of?
So you want to approve a 60%?
65.
65.
So an additional 15%.
Okay. So that's an additional 15%, which we just learned.
Sorry, that was my original. That was my original, but it's the motion should be 10. I apologize.
So it is 60.
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry about that. Sorry for the fright.
All right. So I actually didn't get a mover and seconder for C, but maybe just looking at a nod of heads, you know, if it's amended to 60%, is everyone okay with that? All right. So we'll move it at 60 with Councillor Zhao and Councillor Kiefer seconding it. Okay. Any discussion on this one? Councillor Kiefer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to support my colleague and what she's proposing here, because I think it's critical for the industrial section, not just in the entire region, but in Cambridge in particular. So thank you for supporting that.
Good job, Carl.
Okay. In the interest of moving things along, okay. So all those in favor? Any opposed? Okay. One opposed. Okay. Thank you. All right, so the next one is the 50% discount on non-residential for qualifying office space. Do I have a mover for that, please? Councillor Galloway, Councillor Jowett. Any discussion? All those in favor? Any opposed? That's carried. Okay. So E, exemption for downtown core areas in the City of Cambridge, provided a similar exemption is included in the City of Cambridge development charge bylaw. I think Councillor Kiefer and Councillor Jowett would like to move and second that. Any discussion? All those in favor? That's carried. Okay. Redevelopment allowances, section F. So we can move I and 2, I guess. 1 and 2 at the same time. Yeah. Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah, I'm just going to move 2F with the change in sub 3 being 7 years to 20 years instead of 7 to 15 years. It says 7 to 15, so I'm changing it to 7 to 20.
Yeah, 7 to 20.
That's what I'm moving. And it's seconded by Councillor Jaworski.
I didn't see Jaworski's hand go up to second it. All right. Okay, so we all clear what we're doing there? All right. Okay, all those in favor? Opposed, if any, that's carried. Okay. G. So Councillor Foxton's conflict is noted for G. Councillor Urbanovic?
Thank you. So 2 little g, little double I, number 2. I'm moving the whole thing with the change to that one and adding the words that the existing regional development charge exemption provisions remain in place for any applications applied for by July 31, 2019, with an intent to proceed with a brownfield redevelopment application by July 31st, 2019. And hold on just one sec. I just got to read what I sent you guys. 1 second. And obtain a record of site condition, other required permits, and an approved brownfield application prior to the expiration of this new RDC bylaw on July 31st, 2024. And it's moved by myself and seconded by Councillor Jaworski again. And if I can just briefly speak to it, I mean, I had a whole rationale down, but I'll shorten it up to basically say, you know, I mean, this is the big issue that we heard about from everyone. We know that brownfields are important for us to get cleaned up. They have huge potential for residential and employment lands. It's repurposing or reusing land, and that's as important as programs like our recycling and so on. It helps transform our cities and towns and support our urban form. And more importantly, this really is trying to take a similar approach as we took with the downtown RDCs, where we gave people notice. So, you know what, if you get in this intent form, and so staff are going to have to come up with this intent form between now and next week, but I mean, it's a very basic, let us know that you're going ahead with this, and then you've got time to get the work done that you need to get done. This is really about fairness, consistency, doing the right things for sustainability, and ultimately it's also about protecting our greenfields and our countryside line in the long run, because we're going to be reusing properties that we already have in the urban cores of our cities and towns, as opposed to seeing greenfield development. And I can say a lot more if I need to, but I'll spare everybody that.
Okay, thank you. So I just want to be clear now. So we're looking at G subsection 2, and then and then subset 2. So right. You're adding this recommendation
adding those words.
And then the rest continues as printed.
That is correct. So in other words, if you show up on August the 1st and you haven't provided any sort of intent, much like with the downtown bylaw, if you showed up on March the 1st, the new rules kick in, and you've got the you've got the 100% through to 2021, the 50% from 22 to 24, and the 1 million limit.
So the intent is that the existing brownfield redevelopment financial incentive program stays in place until, if you get your application in by July 31st of this year.
Right.
Okay. And can you just, Madam Clerk, please read back the wording for the proposed amendment?
So added to item 2G, subsection 2, clause 2. Not sure if I got that all right.
Yep.
Would then be that the existing regional development charge exemption provisions remain in place for any applications applied for by July 31st, 2019, with an intent to proceed with a brownfield redevelopment and obtain a record of site condition, other required permits, and an approved brownfield application prior to the expiration of this new RDC bylaw on July 31st, 2024.
You just missed the word application, with an intent to proceed with a brownfield redevelopment application.
Okay.
Because what this is essentially saying is somebody is not going to have their record of site condition, they're not going to have all this other stuff by July 31st. All we want to know is that they have a project that they want in the queue. They'll have it in the queue. They've got the time to do the work that they need. That's what we heard from everyone. And I think that's being fair and reasonable and consistent with the way we did with the DCs. I mean, if you look at our website, even our regional website, with the downtown development charges, made it very clear. They expire February 28th. There was nothing on the website under brownfields to even suggest we were reviewing them. So this is really just being fair in that respect.
Okay, I think I have a clear understanding of the intent and maybe some questions about the wording, but let's turn it over to committee. Councillor Galloway.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support the intent here to try to grandfather in those particular projects that are already underway and have proceeded to certain points, but yet, of course, they don't have records of site condition, which are largely out of their control. The timing there is out of their control. I'm just not so sure, Councillor Vrbanovic, the way you've defined who would be grandfathered is sufficient, because it could lend itself to just about anybody coming in with an intent to do whatever on whose ever property they might think they want to do something on. I think we have to put some more definition to that. For instance, they should own the land. Or they have a signed purchase agreement for the land. Not that some speculator is going to come along and says, well, I see a site over there. I think I'm going to buy it. I think I'm going to apply to get grandfathered on the region's grandfathered list. I think we need staff maybe to, the whole idea, which you're proposing and I support, is to be fair to those projects that have already made commitments that now we're kind of pulling the rug out from underneath them to a certain extent. They're the larger projects, they're not the smaller ones. And we want to get them grandfathered so they can continue with basically the business plan, the financing model that they use to make their commitments by. So it's going to be contained to a fairly limited number of projects. But we have to be able to, in the bylaw, I think have clear language as to who could be grandfathered. And I don't know if we can work out the wordsmithing here today in regards to that. But just to allow, as your wording, we haven't had a lot of time to think about this, to allow anybody who wants to file an intent, you could have a developer file 20 intents on 20 different properties that they have no relationship with, but it would reserve their right, who knows how many years from now. They've made no decisions, they've made no financial commitments. I think we want to make sure whoever we grandfather actually is in the pipeline, so to speak, and have made commitments. And I think that's what your intent is. So I think we need stronger language to define who would be grandfathered.
Okay, thanks, Councillor Galloway. I had this suggestion with Councillor Vrbanovic earlier, sharing the same concern. Another option might be that's similar to the example that Councillor Vrbanovic gave with respect to the downtown exemptions, that we would say the existing Brownfield Incentive Program expires 3 years hence, and then the new one comes in 3 years from now. And we continue the existing process. The applications come in. There's not going to be a rush of, potentially spurious applications over the next month. The program stays in place for 3 more years, and we have a firm deadline at that point. So that just might be another option that I'll just put on the table. Councillor Harris?
Yeah, you know what? I definitely concur with that suggestion, and I look at number 3 as well. We heard from a delegation on a particular large site, I think in Kitchener, that would be dramatically impacted by that change as well under the current rules with the timing aspect of it. So I would say perhaps next week when staff come back with clarity on this, that it is very clear. But I think that your suggestion of 3 years with a hard deadline or hard date would have perhaps avoid this mad rush, the speculation perhaps, and that it would be given proper notice to people. And I think that's another component that, advertisement in the paper or whatever the case may be, but proper notice to these folks, because I think this has been a fairly quick exercise, particularly on the Brownfield program.
Okay. Councillor Jaworski?
Thank you. Through the chair, my comments were on the second aspect of Councillor Vrbanovic's motion, which says that even after that, even though you've applied by July 31st, then you still have to make the hurdles of the RDC, of the record of site condition, and then the building permit prior to the fifth year. So even though there might be spurious ones, which I assume there will be some, the reality is it's I call this the giddy up clause, where you have to actually, you can put in your horse in the race, but you have to giddy up because it's going to expire on you regardless and be worthless to you. There's no holding it anything special, or at least that's our intent.
So Councillor Vanovic, I have 3 other speakers. Do you want to wait until the other speakers are finished? Sure. Yeah, okay. Chair Redmond.
I appreciate getting the wording, and I appreciate the spirit of it, and I do concur with Councillor Galloway that we need clarity. I do disagree that we just extend it till 2024. I think if the spirit of this is getting people in the queue who legitimately are in there and for some reason felt unaware, or we all know that the Ministry of Environment is very slow and moves the goalposts often, so it's been a complex process. But there will always be people who claim they were uninformed. There will always be people who will come in at the last minute. And so I think there does have to be a line in the sand. And I do support having the date of July 31st, 2019, and then meeting all the hurdles. If we need clarity around who is in the line or how we decide that, I would agree with that. I think that this has been a huge exercise, and I would reiterate to everybody around this horseshoe that these funds are invested in growth projects. So if we decide we're going to build a new wastewater plant, the only part of it that we can use regional development charges for is the expansion of that due to growth. So there's a lot of parameters around where this money is spent and how it's collected. And there are only two other sources, user rates and taxpayers' money, to fund the foregone revenue and to service the debt if we have to go into debt to expand these services. So I take this seriously. I think this is a good balance, but rest assured that wherever that line in the sand is, there will be people who said, I didn't know, and they're going to say, yeah, but it shouldn't apply to me. So I would be fully in support of the initial wording that Councillor Vrbanovich used. And if we need further clarity to sort of satisfy Councillor Galloway's concerns, I would support that. I'm not going to support the fact that we're just going to punt this till the next regulatory review.
Okay, Councillor Clark.
Well, Chair Redmond said basically what I was going to say. I think I'm very supportive of the initiative if the purpose is to recognize the investment that people have already put into their projects and not wanting to change course on them. But I wouldn't want to hold it open for people who haven't made that investment. I don't think we're in a position that we can afford to do that.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Erb.
I would too support what Councillor Redmond was asking, or suggesting. The question I would have, though, is earlier when we said we thought there was 3 or 4 projects in the line before July the 31st. Michelle, is that an accurate number? That we may not be looking at many more than that?
Through the chair. So it would. So when I referenced the 3 projects, they were ones that are very close to meeting the requirements for a complete application. We do have others that we would consider in various states of moving through the record of site condition or the cleanup process associated with the site. I think the challenge is that some are very early on in the process, and some are more fully developed or more fully invested in that process. And trying to develop criteria in an equitable way, I think, would be challenging.
Yeah, I would be concerned that we may be putting staff in a difficult position trying to make those decisions of who's in and who's out by July the 31st, and how we would have some kind of a weighting or criteria to make that a fair decision.
Okay. Fair enough. So Councillor Harris, and then I'll go to Galloway, then Vrbanovich.
Well, I would just go back to perhaps that original delegation that spoke to the fact that they've sunk significant dollars into the remediation on a brownfield, but that there's no formal process likely here at the region I think that, am I correct to suggest that that was the case in that particular location? There weren't nowhere near far along the process, including the MOE approvals, to actually trigger. So that would be considered I would look at that as a project that has had some significant investment, and it's happening, but yet there was no formal process to trigger the fact that it would have taken advantage of this program, or am I incorrect in that assessment?
Michelle?
So maybe, could I get you just to sort of paraphrase again how you're
Well, there was that
characterizing
site at Ottawa. It was the LANDx.
The one in Elmsdale?
That talked about the $10 million remediation on the brownfield, yet there's been no perhaps application record of site here that would actually make them eligible. They already are eligible?
Well, they indicated there's an application that's in. They've submitted an application.
So through the chair, they have submitted an application. They do not have what we would consider to be a complete application, so they haven't been able to submit all of the requirements. They are waiting on the record of site condition and certificate of property use from the Ministry of the Environment. And once they have that, then they'd be able to finalize their cost submissions. So those are the two, key components that we're waiting for. But I would suggest that they are fairly well advanced in terms of their process.
But to clarify, would they then be eligible under the old rules, as Councillor Verbanovic suggests?
My interpretation would be yes, because they're in the pipeline already.
All right.
Michelle? Michelle, would they be in if Councillor Verbanovic's motion amendment is approved? Would the gentleman from Elmsdale, LANDx, I believe, would they be considered in the pipeline and subject to the existing incentive program if they obtained the record of site condition within the next 5 years?
So my understanding of what's being proposed and either the letter of intent or the criteria that would be developed, this would be one of the candidate sites that we'd be looking at transitioning.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, fair enough. That's how I would understand it. Okay. Barry?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just to be absolutely clear, so the idea here is that staff would develop a very basic form between now and next week, which would be the intent, I just gave it a name, intent to proceed with a brownfield redevelopment application. So whether it's the Elmsdale project, whether it's the Schneider's project, whether it's the Bud project, or a number of others that we know exist. I know there's some in Waterloo and Cambridge. At one point, Mayor Shantz indicated, I think, that there might be one in the townships. They would signify their intent by July 31st, which was the original sort of deadline that staff was trying to identify, so that we have a stopping point. And I've tried to not go beyond that stopping point to recognize some of the concerns that Mr. Dyer has indicated in the long term. Having said that, I appreciate where Councillor Galloway is coming from, and I mean, my understanding was that would have always referred to property owners and those that have deals. But if that needs to be clarified as part of that process, certainly that is my intent. And between now and council, staff can take a look at that. So if you're under the old rules, you then basically have 5 years to get your stuff done. Your record of site condition, the completed application, all that stuff. And it needs to be done by the time this next bylaw ends. That's what this motion is proposing. And so there's no sort of, punting this 5 years. It's just making it very clear. That's when it ends. Put that on the website, much like we did with the downtown thing, and it signals to everyone that's what's going to happen. If you apply on August 1st or December 1st or January 2020, then the new rules apply to you, and you just go through it with the new process, which has limits and everything attached to it.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. Councillor Galloway.
Well, I think we have to just keep in mind what we're trying to accomplish here. We're trying to accomplish, in my view, two things. One is we're trying to phase out the unlimited exemption, and we're trying to contain it to $1 million. And so we want to make sure that we're not going to allow a whole bunch of new projects to start to qualify under the old rules. So we have to make sure that that doesn't happen. And the reason we're doing this is for fairness, because there are a certain number of existing projects in the pipeline that have made very major commercial decisions based on existing rules and used those numbers within their, their funding models, and we're trying to accommodate them. But we really need to work hard to make sure that we don't open this up too broadly to a whole series of new applications. So I was concerned when the chair indicated maybe we just extend the bylaw for another 3 years. I would be opposed to that, because that would allow all kinds of new projects to qualify under the old rules. We really only want to grandfather those projects that have already been purchased, are well into are in the pipeline to whatever extent, have made their financial commitments, and we need to be fair to them in terms of the program. So I agree with Councillor Verbanovic that staff should, try to define that. Land ownership would be clearly one of those criteria. You already have to own the land or have a signed agreement of purchase of the land. You can't just go around and knock on doors and say, I want to put in an application on your behalf, because the July 31st deadline is coming, and somehow or another qualify for a large exemption that we really aren't intending to provide in the future. Trying to get out of this business to a certain extent.
Okay. So I guess there's two ways in which we could proceed, or probably multiple ways in which we could proceed, but one would be to deal with the amendment. Maybe this is the best way, is to deal with the amendment. Sounds like there's support for the amendment. There seems to be a consensus for some kind of grandfathering, but even though we have some concerns for that grandfathering. So we could vote on the amendment, and maybe subject to staff providing additional information at next Wednesday's council meeting on how the implementation would work. I see some nodding. Is that fine? Okay, so I'll keep my second suggestion to myself, and we'll just go with that one. So let's deal with the amendment. If we approved, so remind me where we are, Madam Clerk. So if we've moved and seconded the whole item 2G as amended, and then we'll amend it further, subject to staff clarification on implementation of the grandfathering, to come back to council on Wednesday, whatever the date is next week, 26th. All right? Okay. Councillor Harris?
Would that also include item 3? Yes.
Yeah, all of G, yeah. Including 3.
I'm just asking.
Yep.
It includes 3.
Yeah, Councillor Banovic?
So 2G includes sub 3, but I'm not changing the million amount. So in other words, if you fall under the old rules,
yeah,
no limit. If you fall under the new rules, it's $1 million.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Okay, Councillor Erb?
So the amendment to or the information that would be coming back, would staff be able to give us some kind of an additional cost to the region then, similar to what we got from going from 50 to 60%? That would be part of it?
Yeah, they could do that.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure.
Economic value was to the projects that we have given brownfield incentives to what that tax revenue is now. I want to know that number as well, because that's.
We have that information. We've shared that. We've shared that with committee.
I think last I brought that up during a delegation, and I had asked for, I guess, if there was a cost benefit analysis, but I'd like to see if we're coming back with the cost. I also want to know relatively, per 100,000 or per million, whatever we spent,
Yeah.
the additional revenue generated by tax base.
Yeah, the return on investment, we have that,
It's
those
just equally
numbers,
as
Councillor
important
Harris.
to know the cost.
Yeah, we have those numbers. Yeah, we have, so we'll just send you that report. Okay, so are we ready for the question then? As amended and supplementary amended with information to come back next week. So that's all of 2G, Councillor Foxton's conflict noted, including 2H as well, right? Because it's the numerology and alphabeticizing is very confusing, but we all know what we're talking about. Okay, so all those in favor? Opposed, if any? That's carried. Okay, good. Number 3, no public meeting is required further to this public meeting. Mover, Councillor Foxton. Chair Redmond, all those in favor? That's carried. Okay. 4, let's see, can we do 4, 5, 6, 7, all at once? Councillor Jaworski, Councillor Nowak, all those in favor? That's carried. Okay, no, hang on. 5-2, that the region take no action on the request for exemption for long-term care homes. Councillor Chair Redmond, seconded by Councillor Kiefer. Any discussion? All those in favor? That's carried. Okay, great. Information correspondence, other business, motion to adjourn. Councillor Foxton, Councillor Clark, all those in favor? We're adjourned. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks to the delegations as well. You're welcome.